I've been following Greenlandic politics for 25 years now, and to me the core question has always been how to achieve equality. In the early 50s, the leading voices among the few Greenlanders who were consulted aimed for equality of the individual Greenlander as Danish citizens under the 1953 Danish Constitution. In recent decades, it's clear that, to me at least, that the goal has been to make Galashlip equal as a people among other peoples. And the trouble is, of course, that not all peoples command the same amount of resources or the same number of peoples of citizens. So all peoples might ideally come to the table with equal rights, but not all peoples have the resources necessary to ever reach the table. Every people, or most people, might long for independence, but even the mightiest find that they are in some aspects dependent on their neighbors, and maybe even sometimes on their enemies, just as the Americans who produce their rare earths, or the Americans who supply their energy. So for most nations, the real question is not how to be independent, but how to organize interdependence. For small nations like Greenland, the question might be how to organize dependence in a dignified way that allows you to feel equal, even if you still rely on others, where you insist on some fundamentals, but agree to compromise on less important matters in order to make things work. So for at least 3 decades now, the concept of free association has popped up as one name for how to make Greenland equal. The concept as such originates in United Nations work to secure decolonization after the Second World War. In United Nations, free association became the name for a space of acceptable ways of organizing relations between just sovereign independence and the wholesale integration in the metropole. Acceptable ways securing self-governance without choosing between these two extremes. And actually, if we look beyond formal decolonization, there are other associations between states that are free, may have similar substance, similar formal form, but the label free association refers only to these results of decolonization. There's a few in Greenland that has given free association serious thought. We'll hear one of them in a moment. There's a few others that work with this concept as a label or a slogan. But now we have a draft Greenlandic constitution ready for when Greenland one day claims independence, and hence when Greenland is ready to claim equality to other nation states. This draft text doesn't insist that an independent Greenland should enter into free association, but the draft does open to this possibility. At the same time, there are some Danish politicians and informed part of the Danish public that seems to be getting it, that the current arrangement may not really be viable in the long run. So that's basically why we invited you from abroad and from town to this seminar, to see whether we could find inspiration from afar, from history, from legal thinking, to inch a little closer to finding out whether free association could facilitate equality. More important, finding out what elements would be important combining for a free association to feel like equality. We do that in 3.5 sessions. First, we have a keynote, 2 presentations, and what role free association has played in Greenlandic history and thinking. Second, we have a session presenting experience with and without free association from the Cook Islands, the Marshall Islands, and Puerto Rico. And third, we have ended up with a session of virtual presentations on the legal opportunities and tripwires involved in trying to find a form of free association. After each panel, we invited a discussant. One of them is still up in the air, literally speaking. And we set aside time for town hall style debate, dialogue, questions and answers. We very much hope that all of you will use the opportunity to share your thoughts with us. And finally, we've invited actually a lot of politicians to contribute reflections on the problematics. But even at this point, we're a bit unsure whom of them make it from the Inatsisartut to come. So we'll see about the session, the format of the last session that will appear later in the afternoon. I should inform you that we allowed, and you see them over here, a couple of journalists and others to follow the seminar by streaming. I should welcome you as well. The camera is up there. But apart from the 3 virtual presenters in session 3, we really want to keep the debate and the dialogue in this room. So it's not a hybrid seminar in that sense. We will record the presentations from up here, but we won't point the camera or the mic to the audience. So don't feel that you will be captured for eternity. We could really speak freely in the when you say something. On the way, we'll have coffee and cake, and at 1:45, we'll go to Ilisimatusarfik's canteen for lunch. Toilets are in that direction. You'll manage to find them. So we're really ready to go now, except I need to share my gratitude to our sponsors who made this possible. And it's actually been quite a jigsaw puzzle to be able to fly our guests in here. So I'm very happy that the Icelandic Consul General in Nuuk is here. Who's really been helpful. Also, the Danish American Fulbright Commission supports specialist participation from the US. The Danish Minister of Defense allowed this seminar to be a part of the annual contract that the ministry has with DIIS, because I'm sure Greenland must be some kind of a framework condition for whatever Danish security politics there can be. And then, of course, Nasifik and DIIS closed holes in the budget, and we're in this beautiful place also. So we should thank Ilisimatusarfik, or who's the auditorium. This is
on paper it's shared.
It's shared. So we'll thank them anyway. And we should thank Helga Nuuk there for all the practicalities as an intern for Nasifik, and Marie Barse from Mass Communications, who most of you won't have anything to do because she's trying to keep the virtual presenters in the room. So now I give the floor for the first session to Jeppe Stransbjerg. As you all know, Jeppe is an associate professor at Ilisimatusarfik and Danish Academy of Defense, specialized in political geography. I'm currently studying Greenlandic military relations, I think, but he won't really say anything himself. He'll just chair the session. So, but he's doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Do I need to speak into this? Anyway, I'm just here to say welcome to our first speaker. It's a really great pleasure to introduce you. Nuuk, Clark, you're the only keynote speaker for today. We're very pleased that you've taken the time out. We know that you're busy and everybody wants to talk to you. Nuuk Clark is the deputy. I'm just reading it because there's so many titles. You're the deputy foreign minister for Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs, Business and Trade and Climate. You also had a number of distinguished positions within the government of Greenland. You also played a role in the Greenlandic Constitutional Committee. And more than a decade ago, you worked with the Bilateral Commission on Self-Government, as far as I believe. But today, and this is important, you're here in a private capacity. You do not speak in an official capacity, but as a private mind. And Nuuk Clark, you have a Master of Philosophy from Aarhus University, and I've been doing some research on the semester shelf. Your thesis was titled Greenlandic Self-Determination or Secession Philosophical Consideration. And you have also published academic work on the status of Greenlandic Inuit and the shape and status of the Greenlandic polity. And so with those words, I just say, I think we all agree with me that we're very keen to get a share of your thoughts on the topic. We have about 20 minutes and the floor is yours.
Morning, everybody. When you mention all those things, I'm reminded I'm not 35 anymore. And sorry for being a little bit late, but that's the unpredictability of having small kids and to have their needs tended. I've written quite a number of notes here. I will not do a speech as such if you fall asleep. If I do that, but I'll speak from what comes to mind, and I'll speak according to what I have experienced since I started with this subject about 20 years ago. And of course, in this story, in this perspective, I'm James Bond. There might be other James Bonds, but in this story, I'm James Bond. First, again, UK disclaimer, I speak not on behalf of the government of Greenland here. I speak here due to the experience I have and the things I have been involved in. We'll try to speak as freely as possible on what I've experienced and also what I've been involved in. As mentioned, I have dealt with this subject free association for about 20 years now. So compared to Gudmundur, I'm a mere juvenile. Gudmundur is actually someone I've worked quite a bit with during the years. But the way I started getting into this subject was in 2002, when there was something called the North Atlantic Group in the Danish Parliament, the Danish Folketing. And that was a group consisting of Høgni Højdal of Faroe Islands, Lars Emil Johansen from Greenland, and Ruby Kleis from Greenland. So three very strong politicians in their own rights. But they decided to form a group. And that group decided to form international constitutional working group, where Gudmundur as a professor was part, and from Denmark, former Minister of Justice, but also Professor of Justice of International Law, Ole Espersen was a member. And then from Finland, Professor Lauri Hannikainen was an expert on minorities and so forth. And then we were two students who came into this group in order for us to, for Greenland and Faroe Islands. So we were two students from Greenland, one from Greenland, one from Faroe Islands, who were invited to be part of this group and work and learn. And also, so that we could pass on the knowledge that was gathered in this group for later on. And now 20 years after, I'm still working on it a little bit. So what we did was, in order to understand the Faroese and Greenlandic relationships with Denmark and in international law, we looked into the history of the two islands. So we had some people dig into the national archives in Denmark and found out how Greenland and Faroe Islands became part of Denmark, finding documents on considerations, internal considerations in Denmark, Greenland, and so forth. And that, of course, is important to know something about if you are to find out what the rights of self-determination of Greenland and Faroe Islands are. In this group, Sjúrður Skåle, who's also here following, and who's now a member of the Danish Parliament, was secretary to this group. And also within North Atlantic Secretariat, we had St. Jacob Helps, who was the head of Secretariat, who's in it by himself also a very strong political writer. So within this group, we did a lot of digging, a lot of discussions, a lot of looking into different international law. We also had a trip to the UN, met with decolonization office, legal officers, and so forth within the UN. Gathered information, and in the end, we came up with 2 reports. One report, legal report, that would call something like the right of national self-determination, Faroe Islands and Greenland. And that was edited by Sjúrður Skåle, and we all contributed with articles. And then a sources report in Danish called Kilder til Færøernes og Grønlands historie. So something like sources to Greenland's and Faroe Islands history. And those were the documents we found from the Danish archives that were dealt with in that report. And basically, much of the work that was done there was kind of pre-work to what Anne-Christina Hermann has done in DIIS. Basically, much of the same material or work on that situation when it comes to Greenland. Yes. So these reports came out and made a splash in 2004, and basically showed that Greenland, the inclusion of Greenland into Denmark, had not necessarily really done according to democratic standards, to say the least. And I think most of you know the story, but for those who don't, in short, in September 1952, the Greenland Landsråd was given 3 days to decide on whether or not Greenland wanted to be part of Denmark, integration or not. It was a yes or no, and no possibilities of giving preconditions or comments. Material for the decision was handed out at the beginning of the meeting, and all the advices were of the Danish state. So that was not the best of democratic processes, one may say. And I think Gudmundur also has pointed out that actually this Landsråd Country Council did not have the mandate to make such a decision on behalf of Greenland people. And that is key, and that is important to remember. Because what also happened in those years in the world was that the world had just been through 2 world wars. And after that, basically the world said, enough. We need to cooperate. We need to do away with wars as much as possible. We need to do away with discrimination of peoples. We need to cooperate together, develop together, create more equality. And one of these efforts was decolonization of the world. Decolonization of the world. And that is something that's also reflected in the UN Charter. And it got its own pillar under the UN of cooperation and focus. And Greenland got on a list, on the list, on non-self-governing territories list. I think it was in 48, 49, something like that. That Greenland got on the list on the non-self-governing territories. That's basically the politically correct name for colonies. And in the work, the colonizers had to report into the UN, and all the UN member states could sit in and listen to what was going on in this colony. It was not the most ideal situation for a colonizer because they were examined and questioned critically. And it's no fun to sit there and tell about not so good stories or things in the colonies. So what we found in the archives was that basically there was a pretty picture painted of the relationship with Greenland or Greenland to the UN, to the world community by Denmark. And that's been written about several times later on. So there was something called the list of factors, in Danish factorliste. And that's how you recognize the colonies. It also mentioned what rights or what opportunities the colonies should have in moving forward on their political status. Because the purpose of the whole thing within the UN was to create a mechanism where the colonies could move forward in their political status, either through integration into the metropolitan state, through free association, or through full independence. 3 options, and those options were known in the beginning of the 50s. So the decision in the Landsråd 1952, that was where the Greenland Country Council or Landsråd was supposed to make a decision on behalf of the Greenland people, by whom, by the way, they didn't have a mandate, given a mandate, but they were to make that decision. They were not presented with the option of free association. Again, it was a yes or no to integration. At the time, there had been a little bit of debate internally in Greenland about rights. The Greenlanders wanted to be Danes. At least that's what some sources say, or if you read the media, one can interpret some of these things, perhaps. It was not a free country. It was not a free press at the time. One could say the part of wanting to be a Dane was to have the same rights as a Dane, because you didn't. But it could also be that you wanted to be a Dane. That's an interpretation that historians may be better at than I, and yeah. So I'm not so much James Bond there. So that story came out again, because I remember in high school, even my teacher at Greenlandic was telling me Greenland decided upon entering Denmark after giving time period of 3 days. That was fun because I think I was 18, 19 at the time. And I was thinking, okay, 3 days. Yeah. Not thinking about this deeper. I was only a teenager, but it was known. It was known, but it was not even more critical thought. Now, what was interesting also in 52 was that with that process, Greenland then becomes part of the Danish constitution through the enactment of the present constitution in 53. And it's not, again, a process where a lot of Greenlandic elements are included in the constitution. It's not anything where you could say the Greenland values, the Greenlandic language is included, or words, or anything. Nothing on Greenlandic rights when it comes to free association. That's something some Danish professors spoke about, but where one of them who spoke about this, I think it was Al Voss, was told this was a viewpoint that was not up to date anymore. So that process, Greenland becomes part of the kingdom in 53. And this is reported into the UN in 54. And it's approved, again, through a process where not, or reporting that was not, let's say, completely true about the conditions in Greenland. We had Greenlandic politicians being part of the delegation going to the UN, but we found documents saying that they were not allowed to speak freely, and they could only speak on the account of read up papers that the Danish civil servants had written. So that was not free speech. So Danish constitution takes effect. Greenland integrates into Denmark in 53. That constitution, with the lack of the democratic process, the lack of Greenlandic views or values or elements and self-determination, all these things, that constitution is in effect today. Sets the framework of what we can and cannot do. That came out in 2004. And there were discussions there. And then prior to that, in Greenland, we've had a self-government commission from 1999 till working till 2002, 2003. Came up with a lot of recommendations, including how the development of Greenland vis-a-vis Denmark should go or could go, develop, how we could develop. Thing also touching a little bit upon free association. And then we had the Greenland and Danish self-government commission that was established from 2004 to 2008. And within that commission, there was a working group on international and constitutional affairs, where Lars Emil Johansen was the chair. And Greenlandic side, you had Akol Lønge some of the time, and he was replaced at some point by Johan Lund Olsen. There was August Salling, who was at some point also replaced by Anton Frederiksen. And on the Danish side, you had Birte Rønn Hornbæk, Niels Helveg Petersen, and Line Barfod. So quite strong politicians. And Gudmundur was part of the group on the Greenlandic side, and lawyers, we had Ole Spearman, also on the Greenland side, now a prominent lawyer in Denmark. And on the Danish side, lawyers, there were Henrik Sahle, who's no longer among us, but also very, very renowned lawyer in Denmark. He was replaced, I think, by Jens Hartzi Danielsen. I think he's a Supreme Court lawyer at some point, and Frederik Harhoff, been part of the international courts. So very strong people. Now, after I had been doing the work on the North Atlantic group, I had some knowledge which, or insights which were new. So I was asked to be an advisor in this working group on international and constitutional elements. And in fact, in 2006, I was then sent to Cook Islands and New Zealand in order to learn about their free association relationships. And spoke with ministers, professors, lawyers, and other relevant actors, civil servants, diplomats, in Cook Islands and in Wellington. And that knowledge I brought with me home, or to Denmark, not home, but to Denmark, and used within the Greenlandic side, and used in the negotiations on free association. And the elements, especially within the remarks or the legislative notes to the Self-Government Act, where you can find elements on free association. And that's partly due to the work that we did on the Greenlandic side. So the politicians told us to, at some point, Gudmundur and Ole Spearman and some of the Danish lawyers and civil servants from the Prime Minister's office and Ministry of Justice, Foreign Affairs Ministry, and so forth in Denmark, to form a little group without politicians to come up with a chapter on independence. I don't remember how many times we met, but I think 2 or 3 times over a weekend or so. And then we came up with the process that you can see in the Self-Government Act. But then you also have the legislative notes, the remarks to the Act, that is part of the package of Self-Government Act. And there you see the mentioning of free association and a couple of examples like Cook Islands, in Marshall Islands, Micronesia, mentioned Palau, that might be something you can look into. And from the trip and what we found on the free association thing was that as much as we wanted self-government to be free association thing, arrangement. We were lacking what these examples in the world had, and that was their own constitution. It doesn't say within international law you have to have a constitution in order to enter into free association. But what we could see was that all the examples you could see had a constitution. And that became a focal point. So we were basically saying that we need to prepare for us having our own or drafting our own constitution. So that was included in the remarks that we can prepare to have or doing work to prepare for drafting our own constitution. And that was included. So that now we see parts of the draft the constitution. Now moving forward then, again, if I'm to say something to close here, free association is not a solution for everything. It's not necessarily the most super positive thing, but you get more of what we have today. And you have to look at it in a way where it is partly part of the answer we want today. Or if we want something that we cannot attain today on self-government, within the self-government arrangement, then free association can actually do something on that. Which other arrangements cannot be the answer. There have been discussions on federal states. Why can't we just be a federal state? We could, but it's not Bayern or California or states like that are members of organizations we want to be members of. It's nation states, sovereign states. And some of the freely associated states are actually full-fledged members of the UN. Yes, and then there can be politically not so good things between them and the metropolitan state, but that's perhaps not necessarily the main focus, because that's an individual, unique relationship between, let's say, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and the US. Let's say we go into free association with Denmark. Then I've heard arguments, yeah, but free association, the US blew an atomic bomb in Marshall Islands. I don't think Denmark will suddenly have nuclear bombs after we enter into free association with Denmark. I don't think Denmark will suddenly become someone who becomes extremely terrible after we enter into free association. Yeah, it might be more tough, but US will not become, Denmark will not become the US because we enter into the free association. Or New Zealand towards Cook Islands. It will still be Denmark and Greenland, just another level. And yes, there will be negative things. There are also negative things today. Today, we cannot be the member of the Arctic Council in our own name. We can with a free association. Today we cannot become member of the IOC, Olympics, can within the free association. So, and in those questions, we cannot, as a federated state, become a member of those organizations. I can continue, but it's important to remember what is it we want. Can this be the answer for that? And then remember there are unique relationships. These unique relationships do not necessarily become the same thing as ours. We tailor make it to our needs. Yeah.
To introduce our next speaker, Peter Løvskov. You are an assistant professor at the Department of Cultural and Social History. You also work with human rights, post-colonial histories. You're also the chairwoman of the Greenland Human Rights Council, I believe, and you're a prominent voice in anything concerning human rights and identity in Greenland and across country communities. I believe you have about 15 minutes to speak.
And I
Very much.
I will have to, I will first have to say thank you to Miningwa, not only for now, but also for providing a lot of material for me to actually do my presentation. So thanks to Miningwa for going over a lot of this, I'll be able to skip some stuff. Yeah. Excuse me. When we look at, oh, sorry, I have dust allergies. Greenland was, according to how we know history, how we read it as Greenlandic people and Danes, was incorporated into Denmark as it counts in 1953. And there's a lot of differences in how we viewed it in 1952 to 2022. And you can also see how we have developed in our understanding of where we are, where we stand as a people. Here you can see how we are signed in to become a part of Denmark, as it's described from moving from a colony to a county. But why did we move that direction? Why was it chosen not to just get rid of Greenland and remain Denmark as it is? But according to Danish historian Hans Christian Fuller, before the Second World War, Denmark had not really perceived Greenland as something profitable. We were kind of a sinking ship, so to speak. We were even known as the country of the philosopher's stone because people kept looking for a mineral or an oil or anything, but nothing was really ever found. So it was wishful thinking, they thought, until suddenly we had American bases, until suddenly we were geopolitically interesting. And that was why after the Second World War, Denmark decided that we were worth keeping. But we were not really worth reporting about, as it was a bother to report about what the role Denmark had in Greenland. So Denmark started to put itself and stage itself as a role model for other UN nations and other former colonial nations as a good colony power, so to speak. And it worked for many years. We believed them for many years that it was all done with the best intentions, so to speak. As Miningwa mentioned, many people and many texts will say that Greenlanders themselves wanted to be Danish. But when you look at Edward, for example, which is the Greenlandic national newspaper, people will write that they want to have equal rights as the Danes. They wanted to be treated as humans with equal rights as the Danes. That's how it was written in Greenlandic. So if you can read Greenlandic, you would understand that the way that people talked about this situation was quite different than how the Danish version of the text would usually be, which would be translated into, we want to be Danish. So that's why in 1950, when people read that they would be incorporated into Denmark as a county and that they would be equal, they took the chance because that's what they truly believed. So here you can see the first elected provincial council in 1951. Before they would not actually be elected, they would just be chosen randomly, or they would just come and say, I am the person that usually speaks on behalf of this part of my, they were not really cities, but, and people would usually go, yeah, that's true. He usually speaks on behalf of us. He's the one who is the great hunter or who does all of these things. So this was the first elected provincial council. So it was a step forward, it felt like. And they were the ones who were given those 3 days to choose between the 2 options, and not the third option of free association. So that's why when we look on the 50s, that there is actually almost no discussion about that of being a county or being a colony in the same way, because people had no idea that they had the possibility of free association. I'm going a bit fast. Again, we have all of this information thanks to Nuuk. What is really, really obvious when people look into the historical texts, the archives, and anything else, the Greenlandic population was never given a choice. And free association was never presented to the Greenland Provincial Council. And it was deliberately not given to them. And that much is obvious. And when you then look at, okay, why then even give them two options then, if you really want them to choose the second one? The Danish officials were, according to many of the sources I've been able to see, pretty aware of the fact that the Greenlandic people also knew how the situation in the world was, to some extent, and that they had experience with poverty, with epidemics. We had the copper epidemics in the 20s as well. So there was a lot of fear of going back to that time of that misery, and also a fear of, well, if it's not Denmark, what if someone else will then try to colonize us or annex us? So it was a decision they had to make where they felt like, if I want to be a good politician on behalf of my people, I will choose the one that ensures their survival. So that was why it was pretty easy for the Danish officials to ensure that Greenland became part of Denmark. When we look at the discussions in the 1950s, this is in Old Greenlandic, and in this text from September 1952, people are again talking about becoming equal to the Danish population. So it's not about becoming Danish, it's about getting equal rights and options. And you can kind of see that it changes really quickly, even in the 50s. You see here in 1955, a reader asked, well, if we are truly a county of Denmark, then why isn't the landsholding called the countyman? Why is he a landsholding? And here they then said, well, it's because we're not actually on the same footing of the other counties. We're not real counties, so to speak. You can translate this to, we have our own ministry, while all the other counties were under the interior ministry. So they had a different right. So it was already there, obvious. But even before that, when you look at the fact that Greenland was supposed to be a part of the metropolitan state with the same rights, equal rights, in 1951 and in 1953, we got our own laws here in Greenland, criminal laws and others that were different from what you have in Denmark. So we were not on equal footing already in 1953. And those things were noticed by people. But what many have forgotten is that even in Edwards Heritage, even in Avanamio, there was censorship. So it is first now, when we get access to private archives, we can see diaries where people will have had their letters dismissed and not being able to be shown on this national newspaper. So yes, there was dissent in the population, but in the official archival material we have had access to before, it was not very obvious. So we all just assumed that the Greenlandic people were fine with finally becoming Danish. But it has been an ongoing discussion to gain independence. already the same year, 1955, we had the Greenland Workers Association established because of unequal pay between people born in Denmark and people born in Greenland. We see a Danishization of the population where you are divided into the people who can speak Greenlandic versus Danish, where it's obvious if you speak Danish, you get pretty fine life. And we also have children who are sent to Denmark to become Danishized in the beginning of the 60s. It kept going for many, many years. My parents were also sent to Denmark to become better at Danish because their parents decided that it was the best for them, that they would have better opportunities. When we then look at the ongoing thing, because we kept sending people to Denmark, suddenly we had half of the youth, maybe sometimes more in Denmark. So they created the Greenlandic houses. And that they became kind of political hubs where people could meet up and talk about, yes, I do kind of feel the inequality between myself and the Danes. Yes, I do get treated differently. And that's why we see in 67, Dr. Olsen comes out with a text in Danish that could be roughly translated to, is self-governance logically inevitable? And it is something that we still feel to the bone in Greenland to this day, that we want independence. And you see Moses Olsen steps forward and talks about equality more. And that's why I wrote that the polar bear starts to roar, because we had 3 of them at some point, very famously. I have one here with me now. So Greenlandization was a reaction to all of the Danishization. We start to become very extreme in the way we want to be Greenlandic. We want music, theater, everything to be in Greenlandic, and a lot of pro-Greenlandic and anti-imperialist way of movements and thoughts really starts in the 70s. And in Danish, this time period is often written as ungdomsoprør. Not because it's not only in Greenland it's happening, it's also happening in the rest of the world that there's these things. But I don't like to write it that way, because in Greenland, the rebellion was not only the youth, it was the whole population sometimes. We had a lot of different factors that I'm not going to come into right now that ensured that people really, really saw the mistreatment that, from Denmark to Greenlandic people in their perception. When I therefore say that we as a people want independence, I can say it statistically. It's not the youth that are rebelling, so to speak. In Danish media, they often like to talk to only the youth, the colorful young people who are mad at Denmark, so that they can have this infantilization of the Greenlandic wish for independence. Because in Denmark, they still talk about Greenland as the child and Denmark as the parent. So I have numbers that says, no, it's not the youth here, it's our population. From 1979 until 2021, you can see that those, the purple one and the red ones, they're the ones that are pro-independence. And the little blue one you can see that used to be way bigger. That's at some point, one of the only parties that wanted to remain part of the Commonwealth. So it is very obvious the decline of the pro-Commonwealth parties in Greenland. We can see it in our latest election here as well, where 89.6% voted for parties that wanted independence, where only 8.3% voted on pro-Commonwealth parties. So it is not, it is not a simple idea, this of wanting independence. And we also know that we, with the new law, so to speak, new and new, from 2029, we got accepted as a people pursuing to international laws with the rights of self-determination. As such, the steps towards independence are becoming more and more obvious. We know which way we are going. But if you look at the factors for the discussion now, Imperial that came out in 2021 has been a huge part of the awareness of free association in Greenland. Because the discussion have always been on independence, but not so much on free association. We also had the IUD scandal, where children and women all the way down to 11 years old had gotten IUDs inserted into them by Danish doctors. And it was without their consent or their family's consent. And an impartial investigation is supposed to be taking part soon, but it's delayed again and again. And what we really want to get investigated, if I put another hat on as the chair of the Human Rights Council, is whether or not this can be classified as a genocide or an attempt at genocide. And also, the latest factor is also that we're getting a historical investigation from the period from the Second World War until now. What have the Danish government or Denmark and Greenland have had ongoing in that time period? There's many different areas that needs to be discussed and investigated here, and I cannot get into them. But I can say that the awareness of free association is something that we have now in Greenland, and it's more like a stepping stone. It's not an end goal, of course. We would much rather talk about independence here in Greenland than free association. But with the awareness coming up, it might be a new way of discussing new ways for independence. And that was what I had today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to admit that I'm not so good at timekeeping because I start to listen to the speakers and I don't get time, and that's really what I do. Our next speaker is my good colleague Rasmus, associate professor and part of NASIFIK and driving force behind NASIFIK. And you also, I want to say other things, but I need to give the word now. Very clear.
Right. I will give a very brief introduction to the political debates in Greenland. Roughly starting at the same time as Nuuk got interested, if we were to do the very short version, it would be that something Lars Johansen talked about from roughly 2002, later on Hammer. Now it's very much Peter Broberg from Nuuk. That would be the 20 seconds pitch, and now you get the 15 minutes pitch. The presentation is based on a working paper that came out yesterday on the NASIFIK webpage, written together with Ulrik and with Mikkel Østergaard, who until recently was the secretary of the Committee of Foreign Affairs here in Nuuk. He moved to Denmark recently. It is his master thesis on the topic, and we have taken some of the empirics for our working paper, and what I will talk about is from Mikkel's master thesis that Ulrik was supervising some 6 years ago. But we also added up with knowledge that both Ulrik and I had, and we can just hope that some social science or history students will pick up and do a much better map that we present here, also doing some of the Greenlandic sources for this. But you can find the working paper online. I will talk very briefly about the constitutional draft that came out last month. Then I will go to the political debates. And then we have some political science jargon of mixed signals and conceptual stretching. Hopefully that would make much more sense in 10 minutes. And then very briefly, we'll talk about potential partners. This is a picture from an election campaign from the Nuuk video they made. And Nuuk is probably the ones who are talking most about free association as of now, but it's something that's been going on for decades. If we take current events, then the constitutional draft came out less than a month ago. The Commission was tasked in the iterative terms of references. So this constitution should see that, and there were different tasks they were supposed to do, but all of them mentioned free association as something they should look into. However, at least in the draft in its current format, free association is not explicitly mentioned in the constitution itself. We were actually, I think, either hoping, because we had this seminar and likely the concept and discussion, guessing that there would be something about it, but in the commentary, the legal commentary to the draft constitution is mentioned in the Danish version on page 100. I forget the Greenlandic version, but it said that free association could be a possible model within this. In the section about into Article 44 about intergovernmental affairs, and use it as an example. But if we look at say Article 44, it opens up on defense and security, that could be in collaboration with someone else. And I study foreign and security policy, so when I first think about free association, then probably the defense is something that's going to be outsourced, and that could be happening by a model as a free association. And there's some discussion about that. There's also, when Ulrik and I started talking a week ago about some of these things for our working paper, there's also some other sections in the commentary that is maybe a little bit more restrictive in terms of how much you can actually outsource or give up decision power in terms of the defense. That's quite interesting, but that will come to a negotiation at some point. What we do see in the Constitution, even though a draft Constitution, even though it's not explicitly mentioned about free association, you can easily read free association into the way it is framed and the wording of most of it. So this doesn't exclude free association, but it doesn't explicitly mention it or make us that much wiser how we can actually translate a free association into a Greenlandic context. Looking back to the political debate over decades, the prequel Nuuk have already been doing some of the explaining of what happened during the 53 ordeal with the Danish constitution, and Greenland not giving the information about this third wave that could actually been chosen. The next phase is that historians, especially an Icelandic legal scholar that's on my right side here on the Teams channel, Guðmundur Alfredsson, was writing about how free association was not mentioned. Actually, back in 94 already, there was a delegation from Greenland going to the Cook Islands. Hilton was there, and then as Nuuk told, he roughly a decade later, he went to Cook Islands as well to get some comparative insight into at least how one of these of a handful of free association worked in practice and get some knowledge about it. The political debate also started in roughly 2002, and especially during the self-rule commission work. There were discussion with the media, with the Danish part of the other commission, etc., etc. And we also know that discussion within the Greenlandic Commission between Siumut and IA, I don't think Atassut was that fond of the idea back then, but there's been some discussion in those. Also, after the Self-Rule Act, for example, the Kublai administration, the IA administration, discussed the free association, with some of the first discussion about actually making a constitution for Greenland started to happen in 2011-ish. Subsequently, also Annika Hammond used it as an argument quite often when she was the head of government. And now it's especially Nalarak and some factions of Siumut that are making arguments about this. The mixed signals conceptual stretching is hopefully explained better in this slide. When we look over time, quite a lot of politicians from different parties, mainly from Siumut now, Nalarak, but also other parties, have made arguments over time how a free association could fit into this. So the conceptual stretching is an argument we use in political science and in research methods, that you have concept like democracy or sustainability that gets stretched so much that there's so many definitions, it's used in so many different cases, kind of loses all sense. We don't really know what we are talking about. And you can make the same argument in Greenland also, that it has morphed, not really sure what it is, but this is also how free association work on a comparative setting, as will become apparent, I think, in the next panel after the coffee break. In our working paper, and this is also big, was Mikkel in his master thesis look, when he did a comparative study of some of the other cases, is to look at citizen rights, citizenship, economy, and security policy. In some of the initial formulation from politicians, there was an argument that a free association, as coined by Lars Emil Johansen, could put back some love and solidarity into the relationship between Greenland and Denmark. So at that point, there was something that could actually save the relations between Denmark as like a middle ground between full independence and home rule at that time. Later, free association also meant that it could be with other partners in Denmark, say US, Canada, Iceland, Norway. Sometimes it is meant as a middle ground between the current states and full-fledged independence, but it is also sometimes talked about this is like the full independence, their own constitution, being able to go to the Olympics, be part of the Arctic Council, etc., etc. And this is not something that is really weird, that different politicians have said different things over time. We are just trying to make an argument that there are mixed signals looking at some of these things. Other examples include that some of the welfare, under a free association, if Greenland could still, Greenlandic students could still go to Denmark for university or hospitals, etc., etc. And this is also a little bit different over time, how that would fit into the citizen rights scheme of things. It is worthwhile to note that in international laws, in comparative cases, free association is a very loosely defined concept from the UN, and also how we see it in practical terms. There are, at least there's a lot of leeway how you can actually translate a free association into a Greenlandic context. Other important discussions that have been taken over time is related to economy and oftentimes also the block grant. Because back in the time in the early 2000s under the self-rule commissions, the signal from Denmark was, a free association means that you are voting yourself out of the Kingdom of Denmark, then the block grant would stop. That was something that the Faroese was also told at roughly the same time. And various prime ministers and Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Justice from Denmark has said that the block grant will stop if Greenland become a free association, even though it was meant as a middle ground position. That is the signals that the current Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has changed it a little bit, refusing to comment on some of these things. A former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jeppe Kofod, not that many years ago, said that this would rely on a negotiation, and this is my reading of the whole thing. It's very difficult to front load the future, say how much money would Greenland actually get. I don't think it would be zero. I don't think it would be 4 billion as of now, but this rely on a negotiation between Denmark and Greenland, the incumbent government on the day, or Greenland and someone else like the US. Especially in Nalaraq, I try to make counter arguments to the block grant argument, but it's really difficult. I mean, again, it will rely on a negotiation where that would end in the end. I can talk a lot about foreign and security policy, but just said that Nuuk already mentioned that this would make sure that Greenland could actually join some of the more important international fora and organizations that is important for Greenland. I mean, there are other cases from New Zealand that you don't have to be part of everything. You can choose not to. And then we have the whole security dimension to this, that in some of the discussions, defense is one of the most obvious policy areas to be outsourced. There's not going to be a standing army in Greenland anytime soon. There's been some discussion about the Icelandic model that was showing my next slides. So in some of the argument that this is also a middle ground where you can keep working together with the Arctic Command, the Danish Coast Guard, or other part of the Danish military, and or also maybe the American military. Whereas other discussions have namely stressed more the full independence and then keeping some of the really vital part of a society is that you are in control of some of these things. Again, over time, we can find different arguments related to that. Very briefly about partners, and I have some lovely photos from the Hans Island negotiation in Canada. When Biden was in Ilisimatusarfik, I know my colleagues are ultimately lost this picture because you see the Danish foreign minister or former foreign minister stepping 10 meters behind Biden and multiple
What is that?
our important. And then you have a photo from the Greenlandic representation in Reykjavik, which is also interesting in this discussion because I know Greenlandic diplomats really love this, that the Danish embassy couldn't fit a Greenlandic office, so they, for the first time, got their own beautiful building next to the Russians. This is not too that Russia will be a potential partner. I don't think that. But the argument is that it doesn't have to be Denmark, and there are more and more discussions that it could actually be someone else. The US comes up for different reasons. There's a discussion, especially at the argument, made the argument that combining arguments about free association and the Icelandic model of having Greenland's own coast guard and then working closely with NATO or others. In Denmark, I should probably say that that's not when you ask Danish diplomat, do you have someone in a corner office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs looking into free association? They say no, and I understand why they say no, but they deem it too hypothetical to actually use manpower to sit down and do all this. But then again, this makes it more difficult to have an informed discussion what this should actually entail. Concluding remarks in 10 seconds before Jeppe starts throwing things at me. The constitutional process and constitutional draft didn't really spark that much discussion, unfortunately. We, as researchers, we don't really have any normative arguments whether Greenland should become a free association or not. From personal perspective, I think there's a disequilibrium in the where it is now. We should find another model. I just don't know. I don't have the answer. I research other stuff if it should be a confederation, a federal system, or whatever. But what I do think, and this would be my closing argument, is we really need a more nuanced debate internally in Greenland, in discussion with others, but also need to find those comparative findings from the handful of cases that actually exist. Well,
last, also very prominent speaker before our coffee break. It's also a pleasure to invite you, Kai Kleis, to the floor to offer some reflections on the three presentations. You also played a very pivotal role in Greenlandic politics. That started establishing Nuuk. You've been pushing Greenland out of the EU, Brexit. Had various positions in the Greenlandic government as well. Pleasure. Yeah.
I think the mic is mainly for the virtual, so you don't hear that it works. Language. Just speak up.
Just speak up. Okay. Let me start off with saying that I've been civil servant all my time, in fact, and so I have never been a politician, but I have been following, advising politicians, but after my retirement, I've been more and more interested in our future. How do we do next step for our further future for Greenland? If we look at the finance, the budget for Greenland annual budget, we do have about 7.6, about 7.6 billion. And we ourselves just can make ourselves about 3 billion kroners. The rest of it is drop grant and some from European Union also. So, but we always discussing about how good we are, how better and good to be Greenlander here in Greenland without thinking about economy at all. And now we are discussing free association, which is an economic negotiation we had to do with another states, for example, Denmark. But we still debating about our rights, just our rights, but not how we have to do with the economy. The economy is quite, I can say, important for Greenland, otherwise we can't survive here. So it's time, I think, to wake up and begin talking about economy. We do have too much about how good we are and we can do it ourselves. But I think we have to just begin talking about how to do it. We are talking about that we might could have an economic agreement with Denmark or another state for 7 billion, because that's what we need in the first step. And how do we do that? We don't do it just by smiling to our neighbors. We have to show that we are able to fight for our economy. That's the only I can say right now, because you have already talking about free association at that time. So I think it's time to have a wake-up call and in talking about economy afterwards. I am not sure that I can say more about the free associations, because Ilisimatusarfik and Privjord has already talked about these things. So I hope that the rest of the day would be quite interesting to hear from from other countries. Yep. Oh, yeah.
Thank you, and thank you to all the speakers, and apologize for my really poor timekeeping.
We will now move on to a little bit warmer climate, to the Caribbean and the Pacific. And we will start out with Rens van Munster, who is actually originally from the Netherlands. He is the senior researcher at DIIS in peace and violence, and he has been written a lot about the Cold War and nuclear issues. But here today, he will talk about the Marshall Islands as an example of free association. So, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the University of Greenland and to Ulrich for inviting me to join this seminar. For me, it's a topic of academic reflection, but I think listening also to the first panel, you realize that for others it's a lived experience, and I'm really happy to be able to hear those perspectives, and I hope that my little bit can offer some inspiration to the conversations that are ongoing in Greenland. There's only 5 countries that have free association, but the diversity between them is quite big, which is why Ulrich thought it would be a good idea to collect some of the experiences other countries have with free association. And I'm here to talk about the experience of the Marshall Islands in the free association agreement with the United States. The reason I stand here, I guess, is that I've been studying the history of nuclear, particularly cultural history, and particularly history of nuclear testing and American nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. So between 1946 and 1958, the US tested exploded 67 devices in the Marshall Islands. So while they had their own site on Native American land in Nevada, they exploded the largest bombs in the Pacific away from the US population. To give you kind of a perspective on this, in this 12-year period from 46 to 58, the amount of bombs exploded, or the explosive power of these bombs combined equals 1.5 Hiroshima-sized bomb for every day during that 12-year period. Right. The largest bomb exploded was about 1,000 times as powerful as the one detonated on Hiroshima. So Marshall Islands and the United States entered into a compact of free associations in '86. It was renewed again in 2003, and it's currently being renewed again. And just the day before yesterday, it was made public that a new deal has been reached with $7 billion divided for the 3 countries, Palau and the Federated States of Micronesia and the Marshall Islands. So what I will do is I quickly highlight a couple of points about, I think, the nature and character of this association, and I end up by trying to pull out a couple of things that might be relevant to think about in the Greenlandic context as well. So the first, I think, key finding is to understand this free association agreement between the Marshall Islands and the United States as a marriage of convenience. It's between 2 countries that share very little cultural history, and that do not go back together very long in time. It dates back to the end of World War II, when the US beat the Japanese and took over the Marshall Islands from the Japanese, which was a Japanese mandate at the time. It started nuclear testing already a year later, 46, and in 47 were given administrative authority of the Marshall Islands and some other states as a strategic area, which means that the US could build military bases there and develop military infrastructure. And originally the reason was, of course, that they wanted to prevent a second Pearl Harbor. a way to contain Japan or other Asian rising powers. I'll get back to that. So the history between these two countries is quite short, protracted, and also characterized by violence, especially nuclear violence, right? So what did they get out of it? What did they get out of this marriage? And for the US, it's very clear. It was a way to, for the US, the Marshall Islands have strategic relevance. It had so when they entered into the trusteeship agreement as a way of having a presence in the Pacific, and the Cold War kind of strengthened this need. It was a way of keeping the Soviet Union out of the Pacific, but it was also an opportunity to develop nuclear weapons. And after the Cold War ended, of course, the strategic relevance of the Marshall Islands continued. Thirdly, now is the rise of China. The US is worried about, but it's also they also still have a military base on the Marshall Islands, which is a central pillar of the missile defense system. And they also use this base to kind of monitor activities from North Korea. So it's continued strategic relevance. And the free association allows them to keep having a strategic presence in the Pacific without all the difficulties and responsibilities and administration that comes with a trusteeship system. It's kind of, for the US, there was a good deal. So what did the Marshall Islands get out of it? The first thing, of course, they got out of this was political independence. The Marshall Islands got their own constitution in '79, and negotiations about the compact agreement were ongoing already, and were then finally agreed upon in '83 and signed in '86. So political independence, which for the Marshall Islands had long been a strong desire. Since at least the '60s, there have been calls for independence in the Marshall Islands. But they got out of it as well, and here I'm thinking about what I was saying just before, is economic support. And today, the US still provides 70% of the Marshallese GDP, to get about $60 million a year for a 20-year period, and that amount is, I think, going to rise with the new agreement they have. I did a quick calculation, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was going to end up around somewhere about 100 million a year rather than the 60 they have now. And I think it also reflects how important the Marshall Islands are for the US, especially in its competition with China, which is also trying to make inroads in the Pacific. The US is also the second largest employer in the Marshall Islands. The military base employs a lot of people. So these are two things: political independence and economic support, that are of course central to the negotiations about free association. The third thing I think that was very vital is that it allowed the Marshallese to migrate to the US as non-citizens, but they could be there and work and live and study in the United States without needing a visa. And also, I think a very important part is to get treatment for health issues in the US, because the Marshall Islands does not have a very advanced health system itself, and there's a lot of health issues. Some of it's related to the nuclear era and the nuclear test explosions and the after effects of that, but also other forms of these diseases. So the Marshall Islands is countries with one of the largest diabetes rates, for instance. And this allows them to get treatment in the United States. So that right now there's a large diaspora of the Marshall Islands within the United States. About 30,000 live in the United States, whereas 40,000 still remain in the Marshall Islands. And they often will talk about it's a one-way ticket. Few people return, so there's the problems of brain drain. There's also a lot of the Marshallese get quite precarious jobs in the United States, where a lot of them work in chicken slaughterhouses and do very precarious and dangerous work there. And it has also caused some friction within the Marshall Islands because the people living outside the Marshall Islands still have the right to vote and to stand for elections. You can imagine the longer you have lived outside the Marshall Islands, perhaps the less you are in touch with what's actually going on in the Marshall Islands. So this is also causing internal frictions. And the final thing, I think the Compact of Free Association tries to deal with, and with the Marshall Islands, that we can discuss this for a long time, but has to do with colonial injustices related to nuclear testing. So the Compact of Free Association agrees on compensation. Now this compensation has been quite limited and is based on a very narrow interpretation of what the US is responsible for and what kind of damage nuclear testing has caused. So there is some sense of compensation, but there's also a large shared sense that this compensation has not been enough and has been constantly be a part of renegotiations of the Compact of Free Association to address these injustices and to have the US offer more reparation. So to end, I think on a couple of points that could be relevant to Greenland, although I think these comparisons, of course, have their limits as well, because you have to take into account the different political, social, economic contexts within which these agreements are entered into. I think you said it as well, that the Danish Greenlandic relation is obviously going to look different than the US Marshallese one. But still, I think a couple of things that might be useful to think about. And here, I think in the Marshall Islands, I don't think free association is a stepping stone to independence. The Marshall Islands are independent, and they are member of international organizations, including the UN. And the agreement actually specifies that the US has to support the Marshall Islands in becoming a member of these organizations. What it does do is it outsources its security policy to the United States. So the United States can still have military bases on the Marshall Islands, and they do. At the same time, they also have an obligation to defend the Marshall Islands in case of war. So the US has rights, but it also has an obligation. And the Compact of Free Association is an international agreement entered into between two states. So another thing I want to add is that the Marshallese don't have citizenship. So while they have been given the right to work and to have access to healthcare, this has not been unproblematic. So in '96, kind of the Marshallese were collateral damage of change in the rules about who could enter health benefits in the US. And this meant actually that their rights were revoked. And only recently in 2020, this has been kind of this corrected. So for more than 2 decades, actually the Marshallese did not have access to the US health system, at least not everywhere in the United States. So even though they had rights, they were not inalienable rights you would have as a citizen. They could be revoked and they could be changed. I would say the legacies of how you deal, the mechanisms you have in place to deal with colonial injustices from the past, but that kind of keep on casting their shadow on the present and the future. How do you deal with those? Obviously, there's been not a nuclear. The nuclear context is absent in Greenland, but there is the broader question of how do you deal with reparations and compensations for the past. And how do you set up mechanisms that can deal with them and amend for the injustices that were going on? And I think the difficulties of this question and the fact that the nuclear question keeps on popping up, even though they thought it was finally settled in '86, I think is an important reminder that these are very difficult issues that can be hard to solve within a legal text. But finally, I want to say this is very much, I think, an agreement that is until further notice. And that has to do with the fact that this is a marriage of convenience. I think the US is only interested in the Marshall Islands as long as the Marshall Islands has a strategic relevance to the US, right? So this is 20 years at a time, and you never know if it will continue or not, and it has to be renegotiated at the time. So it very much depends on the geopolitical circumstances of the time. Maybe 10 years ago, before China was in everyone's mind, they might not have had been able to deliver such a good deal as they have now. So it depends on the geopolitical circumstances. And for the Marshall Islands, there's also another factor in play, which is climate change and rising sea levels, which may threaten actually the nuclear of the military base that the US still has there because of floodings, which mean that it might not be a useful strategic place anymore for the US in the future. So there's these unforeseen things that can happen along the road that are hard to imagine now, but that may very much impact what will happen in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Miriam Cullen, who is an associate professor in law at University of Copenhagen. And she has been staying with us here at Ilisimatusarfik as visiting scholar this semester. And her focus in research is public and international law, especially with climate resilience and the relationship with human rights. And he will talk about the Cook Islands, since she is also coming from the New Zealand. It's a very prominent speaker about the free association model for the Cook Islands. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Miriam Cullen. I'm associate professor at Copenhagen University, who've been so lucky to have been a guest researcher here for the last 5 months. And I have another 6 weeks left. It's lovely to see so many faces that I've come to know in that time. And I thank all of you for the conversations we've had and the things that you've shared with me. I'm really grateful to be here. It's traditionally traditional in Aotearoa New Zealand to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the land on which you stand and their elders past, present and emerging. I've been told that's not the tradition here, but I hope I don't offend anyone in making that acknowledgement. I feel like in this context it's appropriate. My positionality is that I'm a New Zealand settler woman. I'm from a settler family in New Zealand. I'm an immigrant in Denmark and have been for the last 10 years as a non-EU citizen, which has its own challenges. And I'm an interloper here in Greenland. I have written a briefing, which has also been translated into Western Greenlandic. So some of the things that I'll talk about will be covered in that. But I'll also say that I'm going to diverge from that briefing a little because you can just go and read that. So I'm from New Zealand. New Zealand has a relationship of free association with 2 states, with Nuuk and also with the Cook Islands. It also is responsible for a dependent entity, Tokelau. These places are small Pacific islands. So the Cook Islands is made up of 15 islands. Nuuk is a single island and Tokelau is 3 atolls. They're really small. So, some of the atolls we're talking about is like 10 kilometers square, really small in terms of land mass, but really large in terms of ocean territory. Each of these states have smaller populations than Greenland. So Cook Island has a population of just 17,000. Tokelau has 1,400. Nuuk has 1,600. So much smaller entities than Greenland. So if you're ever told you're too small for independence in terms of population, I hope you challenge that. Of course, I'm really aware that this is not the first discussion of free association ever had in Greenland. I know it's been on the cards for a long time. So rather than give you too much revision. I'm hoping that I'll also bring up to date what's been happening in discussions about free association in New Zealand and maybe a little bit about what the future holds. I'm following some giants on the stage here this morning and really heartened to hear you guys talk about economic factors that should be taken into account. I want to cover that as well. And then also Maningwa, you were talking about Anglo-Saxon versus Germanic legal traditions. And I think that's really apparent when you look at New Zealand's approach, both to its own Indigenous people, Māori people at home. I gave a talk the other day about rights of nature and how those are incorporated into law and how tikanga Māori precepts exist alongside Anglo-Saxon precepts in law. But also in this relationship of free association, it's quite unique. So Cook Islands was listed as a non-self-governing territory when New Zealand joined the United Nations. And in rough terms, that kind of meant that New Zealand had an obligation to seek self-government for for Cook Islands, to push it towards its own governments, to encourage it and support it to go in that direction. And in 1965, the Cook Islands and New Zealand became the first two states to enter into a relationship of free association. And it was kind of a test case to see if the UN would accept the arrangements that they had developed. And what's kind of interesting for an international lawyer and kind of weird for an international lawyer is that that arrangement was not based on a treaty. So normally you would assume that there would be a treaty, a document that would exist between the territory and the colonizer state. In this case, that wasn't the legal basis. So the legal basis was from a mixture of legal instruments and solemn assurances and agreements between the two. And that continues to sort of be the foundation today. So there was an amendment to New Zealand law. There was a Cook Islands Constitutional Act in 1964. Then that appended a Cook Islands Constitution, which was important. But there are also solemn assurances that exist in terms of letters exchanged between the Prime Minister of New Zealand and the Premier of the Cook Islands, and various practices that have emerged as a matter of state practice. And those things are what we talk about as constituting the legal arrangement, even though there's no treaty, right? So it's quite unusual in that sense, but it's still legally valid. So there was a test to see whether the UN would accept this formulation of free association, which at the time didn't have all those arrangements. It has evolved over time. The legal basis has changed, been negotiated, evolved over time as needs shifted. Ultimately, it did. The UN was invited to monitor elections and so forth, and Cook Islands became a freely associated state of New Zealand. What does that mean in practice? So for this instance, it means that the Cook Islands has sovereignty over its own affairs with regard to everything. So New Zealand can act as agent for Cook Islands in foreign affairs and in security, which is kind of similar to Greenland. The difference is that New Zealand has no say. So the Cook Islands must give directions and consent for New Zealand to act on behalf of the Cook Islands. So New Zealand will ask the Cook Islands, do you want us to act for you on this? New Zealand will offer a direction, and that's the only way New Zealand can lawfully proceed. So New Zealand doesn't have decision-making authority. In practice, I'm sure there are discussions going on between New Zealand representatives and Cook Island representatives about the decisions being made, but it's the Cook Islands who get to make that decision about security, about foreign affairs, about their own government. Right. So there are three main features of this relationship. Four if you count the Queen of England being involved, but we're going to put that aside. I know. It's big now, but the Queen at the time when they were making the agreement. So there are three main features. One is that Cook Islanders are New Zealand citizens as of right. So they have New Zealand citizenship. They have all of the things that come with New Zealand citizenship. The second is that the New Zealand government committed to give financial assistance as before. It was already giving financial assistance before the Cook Island became a freely associated state. So it's arguably a state except in this respect, maybe, which I'll get to, but you know, it's freely associated state that still gets the same financial assistance, which goes up and down in accordance with need, which we'll talk about. And there's an expectation, a shared expectation through an exchange of letters, that the laws of both countries will reflect their shared values. And in a way, New Zealanders and Cook Islands have some shared values. Cook Islands Māori, they speak a language similar to New Zealand Māori. It's widely believed that when New Zealand Māori came from Hawaii to New Zealand, they came through the Cook Islands. 16% of the New Zealand population identifies as Māori, and Māori tikanga principles exist to a lesser degree than colonial Anglo-Saxon law, but exist nevertheless alongside Anglo-Saxon law and New Zealand legal system. In New Zealand's policy practice and so forth, everything is in Māori and in English. All of our policies, all of our laws, Māori and English. Your passport is in Māori and English. And so that Pacific Island connectedness, what Māori people would call whakapapa ties, interrelate between those two countries and inform that relationship to a large degree. So I want to talk about citizenship and its connectedness with economy, with money and with rights, which I think are connected. We were talking before about rights and money as if they were two separate things. I think they relate to each other, right? Obviously, ongoing New Zealand citizenship is important, and the way it's mostly talked about for Cook Islanders, and in a sort of surface level way, is that Cook Islanders have access to New Zealand to live, to work, to study. They have access to New Zealand healthcare. They can freely move back and forth, and that's true in terms of climate adaptation and resilience. It gives access to remittances and so forth, which assists in resilience. But legally, what New Zealand citizenship does for Cook Islanders, for Niueans, for Tokelauan people, is more than just rights of access to New Zealand. And I'll explain to you what I mean. New Zealand views itself as having continued responsibility for all of the citizens within its realm. And Niue and Tokelau and Cook Islanders are all within the realm of New Zealand. So as New Zealand citizens, the New Zealand government takes the view that they have an obligation to uphold those human rights. When they acceded to various international human rights conventions, New Zealand did that with respect to also the New Zealand citizens of the Cook Islands, of Niue, of Tokelau. So when New Zealand is considering, for instance, the budget amounts that will be transferred to the Cook Islands, it's taking into account the equity that needs to exist in terms of rights realisation between New Zealand citizens who live on the mainland and New Zealand citizens who live in the broader realm of New Zealand. In addition, under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, New Zealand has a very clear human rights connection to these places, and that there's a human right not to be deprived of your nationality. So nationality, although it's not the same as citizenship, in practice is often treated to sort of citizenship. So New Zealand has an obligation to maintain that connectedness with its citizens that exist in these places. And I think that philosophy, that New Zealand philosophy, Aotearoa New Zealand's philosophy of the sense that it has these human rights responsibilities to all those New Zealand citizens within the realm, underpins the financial assistance that New Zealand provides to each of these territories. It's not an express part, not a written down element of the free association arrangements between Cook Islands and Niue, which came some decades ago. But it's interesting that it is an express part of the more recent draft agreement with Tokelau. So Tokelau in 2007 held a referendum about potentially becoming a freely associated state of New Zealand, similar to Niue and the Cook Islands. This is Tokelau, 1,500, now 1,400 people, but 1,500 at the time. And it only just failed. So it needed a 2/3 majority for the vote to pass, and it just was under the line. In fact, so close to being across the line that the UN and New Zealand and Tokelau left the door open to have another referendum in the future. But when you read the Tokelau Treaty, so they decided, looking back at Cook Island and Niue, that perhaps some legal clarity was required. So they did draft a treaty, a potential treaty between New Zealand and Tokelau. It says, New Zealand undertakes to provide ongoing economic support and infrastructure development support for Tokelau to maintain and improve the quality of life of the people of Tokelau. So that's the basis of that financial assistance. And I was thinking about that in the context of Greenland because, I'm an interloper here, I'm an immigrant in Denmark. When I was reflecting just as a New Zealander in Denmark about potential Greenland independence, the thing that I would always hear back is, well, they'll never be financially independent. They'll never have the money. But well, Does that have to stop? I don't. So, you know, this is me not understanding the politics and being very naive. Obviously, it's a political negotiation, and I understand that better now, although I'm sure not as well as most of you. But that's where my thinking began. So, when you look at New Zealand's approach to financial assistance, it now provides financial assistance every 3 years so that there's some budget planning that can go on for these states. It used to be annually, but now it's every 3 years. It's based on specifically aspects of remoteness, aspects about the need for telecommunications infrastructure, aspects of whether the standard of living available in these places are equivalent to the standard of living available in New Zealand, which is a human right. Any increase in earnings of the associated state does not automatically equal a reduction in the amount of money that New Zealand would give. And there's an acceptance in New Zealand policy that the financial support that is offered to these states is indeterminate without end, right? There's no end date, there's no setup for an end date. An example, for Tokelau, it relies on New Zealand for about 80% of its budget. For Cook Islands, it was actually doing quite well in terms of its economic growth, and it has reached a point, and as a state, where it no longer qualified for overseas development assistance. At the beginning of 2020, the Cook Islands was assessed as being no longer qualified for overseas development assistance, which is another source of income to think about, because it was earning sufficient money, making sufficient money itself, right? Then 2 months after that, COVID hit, and the Cook Islands, the main source of income beyond New Zealand government is tourism. And so when nobody was travelling to the Cook Islands, suddenly it was in dire straits. And thereafter, New Zealand increased, more than doubled. It was giving allotted 75 million for the 2021-2024 period. And it increased it to, I think, 164 million New Zealand dollars because of the impact that COVID was having on the Cook Islands. And interestingly, when you look at New Zealand's approach to all of the Pacific, I asked myself, is this about the relationship of free association, or would New Zealand do this for any of its Pacific Island neighbours, with whom it has quite close relationships? It did increase development assistance or aid to all of its Pacific Island neighbours, but it would be fair to say that it has a fairly unique responsibility in relation to the Cook Islands, Nuuk, and Tokelau. I'm nearly at the end. I don't know how my time management is going. I tried to keep it while I log. So where are we headed? The Cook Islands sometimes talks about getting UN membership. So the Cook Islands and Niue are not members of the United Nations, mostly by choice. So they have elected not to seek UN membership as yet, but they could. There's nothing to stop them from that. They are states under international law. New Zealand has indicated that should the Cook Islands take the step of becoming a UN member state, effectively they would be perceived as sort of fully independent now, and they would no longer have New Zealand citizenship. So they would lose that access to New Zealand citizenship, which is significant, and but is a step that New Zealand has taken. The most recent foreign minister under Jacinda Ardern's government said that they wouldn't get rid of citizenship. So we've had sort of 50 years of states saying that they would remove New Zealand citizenship once that final step of statehood was taken and UN membership was granted. But the most recent foreign minister said they wouldn't. So it's unclear whether that would be a consequence of Niue and the Cook Islands becoming UN member states. Even if that happens, though, and even if they did lose New Zealand citizenship, I'm not sure they would lose financial support, because as I said, New Zealand does give financial support to its Pacific Island neighbours in any case. Right, I think I'll leave it there. I think I've done my 10 minutes, but I welcome questions when you have them.
So last but not least, of our panelists, we have Raphael Cox-Andermatt from University of the District of Columbia in the US. And he is originally from Puerto Rico and has written a lot. He's a professor of law, and he has written a lot about the constitutional aspects of decolonization in the peripheral jurisdictions of the British, French, and the Dutch Empire. And also, he has written a lot about Puerto Rico as well. So we are happy to hear more about the Puerto Rican Free Association.
So anyway, my first words of gratitude go to Ulrich Fram and his team at the Danish Institute of International Studies for their invitation. I'm very honored to finally visit Greenland. I remember when I was a small kid looking at the map, and I was always fascinated by that huge, massive continent. It looked like a continent. And it was the world's largest island, Greenland. So it's a privilege, it's an honor to be here. As the moderator mentioned, I'm a professor of law in Washington, D.C. And it so happens that I am from Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico faces many of the same issues Greenland has been facing for centuries. The only difference is, perhaps the most obvious difference is, that Greenland is in the Arctic and Puerto Rico, as you see, is in the midst of the Caribbean. So Puerto Rico, as you can see, my slide is positioned in a rather strategic geography, in a rather complex geography, a geography that has been essential for the Western powers since the 15th century, but a geography that became even more complex during the post-war period at the height of the Cold War. Puerto Rico, as you can see, is only miles away from Cuba, and it just sits there at the center stage at the meeting place of North America, South America, very near the Panama Canal, and very near the United States. So as a threshold matter, I want to make the following observations. Point number one, with respect to free association, there is no one size fits all. Fundamentally, the United Nations Resolution 1541 of 1960 fundamentally codifies some very, very basic principles. Right? Resolution 1541 simply establishes that a free association arrangement ought to have at least the following two elements: that the associated entity must have its own internal constitution, and that that internal constitution must not be susceptible to modifications or alterations by the principal party. And point number two, that the path to independence must always be readily available. Those are the two fundamental aspects that the United Nations Resolution 1541 establishes that a free association arrangement must have. Now, with respect to the economic dimension, with respect to the political dimension, with respect to the security, the defense, the foreign affairs dimension, that's up to the parties to negotiate. And if you look at the map of the world, and if you look at and compare the situation in the Dutch Caribbean, Aruba and San Martin vis-a-vis the Netherlands, if you compare the Cook Islands, New Zealand, with what happened in the 1960s in the British Caribbean, where London did negotiate free association relationship with Antigua, St. Vincent, Grenada, St. Lucia, Dominica, St. Kitts, you're going to see that each of those relationships are different, right? So
the fundamental question, as I see this for Greenland, is finding out what is in its best interest in terms of what's the type of free association arrangement that really meets the interest of Greenland moving forward, okay? The other point I want to make before diving into Puerto Rico is that when we discuss free association, as was mentioned in panel 1, we are talking about acceding to full international sovereignty. I mean sovereignty with capital S, not sovereignty with small s, as happens with subnational entities in federations. Okay, so when we talk about free association, we're talking about acceding to full international sovereignty. And the last preliminary point I want to make is that free association really is not something that came out of thin air in the Second World War. It's not something, it's not a legal conception that just came out in the 60s in the United Nations, okay? The concept of free association really, in my estimation, goes back to British legal culture. And since the 19th century, if you go back to the 1867 British North America Act, passed by the British Parliament, with respect to Canada, you're going to see that those were the first iterations of this type of autonomic arrangement, right? And if you go to the Statute of Westminster, 1933, whereby the United Kingdom granted Canada, Australia, New Zealand dominion status, whereby those countries were internationally sovereign, but they were still bound to the British Crown, but they were members of the League of Nations, and they could declare war independently from Britain. I mean, those are the foundations of what we now call free association. Even if you go back to the draft, the 1886 draft, drafted by William Gladstone, then British Prime Minister, on what to do with Ireland in the late 19th century, you're going to see that what Gladstone proposed for Ireland in 1886, in a way, was a precursor of what we now call free association. So the idea of autonomy, the idea of having special relationships, political constitutional relationships, of a special nature, I mean, that's not something new. Now, let's talk about Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico, different from, and after I heard Miriam, I think that perhaps Puerto Rico should negotiate not with the US, but with New Zealand. So Puerto Rico has a huge challenge. Puerto Rico is not a free associated entity. Puerto Rico is still a territory of the United States. Now, Puerto Rico has a huge challenge, which is a demographic challenge. We have 3.2 million persons, as opposed to 60,000 or 45,000 in the case of the Marshall Islands. We have a huge population. Our size is relatively small, 3,500 square miles. Unlike Greenland and unlike what happens in the Dutch Caribbean, in Aruba, Puerto Rico only has a non-voting member, a non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives in Washington. So Puerto Rico really has no access, right? I mean, there is no such thing as having a Puerto Rico delegation join the US Department of Commerce delegation to go to Geneva and discuss the WTO. I mean, that does not exist. Now, Puerto Ricans, as the Cook Islanders, are by birth United States citizens. And that obviously means a plethora of other ancillary issues. When they have access to the United States, they can come and go as they wish. If they relocate to the US, then they can elect the vote for the president, they can vote for Congress, etc. Now, Puerto Ricans living in the island have no presidential vote. They cannot elect the members of Congress.
Now, the gross domestic product is around 106 billion US dollars, and US subsidies, especially after the 2016 insolvency of the Puerto Rico government, are decisive. And that's the aspect of this equation which is so complex, right? How to make sense of Puerto Rico's desire to decolonize with its economic and financial realities. That's the that's the crux of the matter. Similar to Greenland, Puerto Rico was removed from the list of UN dependent territories in 1953, just like Greenland. But that did not put an end to the colonial situation. Now, unlike Greenland, and this is something that perhaps we can discuss offline, Puerto Rico has had its own constitution since 1952. But that did not end the problem, because the United States more recently has fundamentally annulled important aspects of the Puerto Rico Constitution. So the Puerto Rico Constitution, and you were discussing this earlier, yes, the United States has delegated authority to Puerto Rico, but more recently has taken away most of the authority it delegated in 1952 as a result of Puerto Rico's insolvency. So the fundamental distinction between free association and the status Puerto Rico has now as a territory of the US is that under free association, the other state will not be in a position to take away authority from you, right? In the context of Puerto Rico, since Puerto Rico is a territory of the US, Congress has, pursuant to the American Constitution, or specifically the so-called territory clause of the American Constitution, plenary authority to take back whichever authority it delegates to the people of Puerto Rico. So, how to decolonize Puerto Rico? What are the options in order to decolonize Puerto Rico? So Puerto Rico, and this was something that was a subject of intense discussion during the last US Congress, and I was able to fully participate in drafting the definition of free association that was approved in the US House of Representatives this last December. Puerto Rico has three options to decolonize. Puerto Rico can actually integrate to the United States as a state of the Union, become, let's say, Florida, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, or Vermont. But that path is a rather improbable path, I would argue, because pursuant to the American Constitution, integration, statehood, is a concession made by Congress. It is not a right a community might actually have. Congress, and Congress alone, decides which territories accede to statehood. That has been the history of the United States since the founding of the Republic. Congress, and Congress alone, gets to decide which territories become a state and under what conditions territories accede to statehood with small s. It is highly unlikely, and it seems to me, after our last ruminations in the US Congress, there seems to be no willingness on the part of both, I guess, the Republican Party and to an extent certain elements of the Democratic Party in opening up the door to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, after all, is a Caribbean nation, is a Latin American nation with its own culture, its own language, its own history, its own literature, and it's pretty difficult to swallow a Caribbean Latin American nation within the American constitutional structure. And again, it requires a majority in the Senate and the House for a state to be admitted into the Union. Puerto Rico faces tough economic challenges, and it is difficult, especially for the Republican Party, Many Republican lawmakers believe that a Puerto Rican state would actually grant 9 extra votes to the Democrats in the House, 2 extra senators to the Democrats in the Senate, and almost 11 extra votes in the presidential electoral college to the Democrats. That's how some Republicans think. Puerto Rico, in a way, the Puerto Rican quest for integration is somehow caught in the internal political crossfire that's going on in the United States. Now, what's the second option for the Puerto Rican decolonization? Well, Puerto Rico can become a fully independent country. Full independence, as was the case of the Philippines. You remember the Philippines were an American territory before they were Spanish territory for 300 something years. Then they were, as Puerto Rico, they were seized by the United States during the Spanish-American War. And then in 1946, as you know, the Philippines became an independent country. Puerto Rico could follow that path. Now, it seems as if Puerto Ricans do not want to follow that path. Independence really doesn't garner substantial support at the polls. And that's a tough reality. So what's the third option? What could be the third way, to paraphrase the New Labour movement of the late 90s in Britain? What could be the third way? Well, the third way could be free association. Free association for Puerto Rico. Now, how would that look? Well, first of all, as we have suggested in this congressional bill that, as I said, passed the House last year, free association for Puerto Rico would mean acceding to full international sovereignty. It would mean that the United States would have to relinquish its powers over Puerto Rico pursuant to the Treaty of Paris of 1898. It would mean that Puerto Rico would now be able to join in the concert of nations, enter into international treaties, devise its own economic, monetary, commercial trade agendas. But it would also mean negotiating with the United States on what to do with our security, defense, foreign affairs, and the economics of the relationship. And that's a path that will require bilateral negotiations. And that's a path that will also require negotiating on another very important aspect, which is the aspect of citizenship. In this bill, for instance, the proponents of free association, we had success in including a provision whereby Puerto Ricans born in Puerto Rico after the declaration of free association, born to Puerto Rican parents with U.S. citizenship, could actually receive U.S. citizenship from those parents if those parents would like to transfer that citizenship to their offsprings, and later on, if those offsprings, when they reach adulthood, might want to retain it, they could retain it. But the citizenship question it's a very difficult issue. It's a tough issue with no easy resolution. And there are many different models, right? The Dutch and the New Zealanders seem to have no problem with bilateral dual citizenship in the context of free association, not so much the Americans in the context of the Pacific Islands. Now, Puerto Rico is kind of a unique case study because unlike the Marshall Islands and Palau and the Federated States of the Micronesia, Puerto Ricans have been U.S. citizens for the last 106 years because Congress enacted so. So those are the challenges before the people of Puerto Rico. And as I close, to my dear Greenlanders, you are not alone. You're not facing all these momentous questions on your own, because there are many of us, some of us in the Caribbean, who are facing similar questions. So hopefully we will together find answers. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
we open up for our questions and answer session. We also have Kenneth Hogue in the room, finally. He has been a little bit delayed with some problems with the flights here to Greenland, but we are happy that he can give some remarks from his side of the table, so as a representative for the Greenlandic government in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I really didn't hear all the presentations, but I read what you've written down in your articles, and it's very much based on that. And of course, I believe it's very interesting description of the arrangement with Puerto Rico and the challenges you have for the future. Very interesting. But I didn't know that free association had a British legal route. That's quite interesting. I mean, the Irish connection that you were explaining, and the Brits are traditionally quite practical people. So, and this is probably the reason why this is something interesting for all of us. And free association, that's not a fixed setup at all. And again, practical and flexible. It's I would call it a group of state arrangements between greater governments, a former colonial power, and a smaller, more or less sovereign government, being the former colony. That's by definition. Puerto Rico, former Spanish colonies, a leftover, I'm sorry, an unsettled issue from the Spanish-American War in 1898, which ended the Spanish colonial rule in the Americas. But still, we are talking about an overwhelming Latino Spanish-speaking culture and community quite different from the Anglo-style Americans. A territory of the U.S., Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens by birth. I'm noticing the article you wrote that U.S. citizenship was granted to Puerto Ricans in 1917, while the Greenlanders were granted Danish citizenship not before 1953. Still, Puerto Ricans don't have the full rights as most, and I'm saying most U.S. citizens are having, as you don't have any representatives on the Hill, but that's pretty much like people in DC, within the District of Columbia.
Well, they vote for the president, though.
Yes, they vote for the president. I think proximity to the former colonial power is important here. The further away, the more different, the greater possibilities for extended autonomy. I'm noticing that you in Puerto Rico don't have any type of foreign policy, and you don't have any sovereignty of your natural resources. And you got the described limits in authority, and these authority that you have can be easily returned to the federal government. We saw that after the recent, was it 2016?
That's right.
Yeah, the economic crisis. And you are putting up these three future possibilities. Of course, you have status quo. That's one possibility. And then you have the three other ones: that's statehood, free associations, or full independence. And rightly, statehood is not a right. That's something that needs a decision by Congress. But I think it's also, when talking about free association, the U.S. will lose its rights and powers in Puerto Rico through free association. So, I mean, the rights that they have according to the 1898 agreements. Are they interested in that? Maybe it's not fully in the interest of the U.S. Federal government. And then you also have the question of citizenship. Puerto Ricans there's so many Puerto Ricans working in the States, and it will be harder losing the U.S. citizenship, becoming
you know, having the possibility of working in the States. And I'm pretty sure this is going to be an important issue, whether or not it will be possible to have dual citizenship or not. That will be extremely important for the people, I suppose. Similarities and differences between Greenland and Puerto Rico. I believe we do have much more sovereignty than Puerto Rico, no doubt. Firstly, because we are having the full control of our natural resources. Secondly, the Kingdom of Denmark is not a federation. It's a unity state. It's not a federation as the US. Why the option of statehood is for the time being not relevant for Greenland. So that's my major comments about Puerto Rico. The Marshall Islands, or the Republic of the Marshall Islands, RMI, under the free association agreement that is running now, 2004 to 2023, the Marshallese government has got political autonomy and authority to conduct its own foreign relations, but the US has the full authority and responsibility for defense and security matters relating to the Marshall Islands. And then citizenship, they don't have any US citizenship, but the Marshall Islanders can work, live and study in the US, though not being citizens. And the absence of full citizenships, the rights and benefits, the rights from free association can be modified or even redrawn. So they could lose all these rights that they have now. That's the way I understood it. Reading the article. As Greenland, the Marshall Islands are strategically very important for the US. I mean, in terms of the present base rights that has been extended up to 2066 and with a possible extension up to 2086. The Marshall Island has been quite known for us through being the testing site for nuclear weapons, from 47 to 58. And there's been a lot of long-term medical and environmental harms associated with these testings. And I understand that this remains probably the most important issue, contested issue between the US and the Marshall Islands. And I understand as well that there are some settlements, some financial settlements, compensations that has been paid, $600 million US, and there's also another $270 million US that has been paid. But still, it's an open wound, probably, to describe it, in terms of the victims and the affected communities. So this issue with the nuclear compensation are the single most important factor for the relationship between the United States and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And climate change being mentioned as a factor as well for the strategic importance. That makes sense if a large part of the islands is actually going into the seas. There isn't that much strategic importance in terms of military bases, but the US has got great concerns for the Chinese influence in the Pacific, and that could be another reason why we would see a continued US presence there. There is a grant being paid of, in all, $800 million US that has been paid altogether, not per year, but altogether over the last 20 years since 2004. That's equivalent to 5.6 billion Danish kroner. We can compare that with 4 billion that we are receiving from Denmark every year. The US further contributes to a trust fund. I couldn't see indications on how much we're talking about here. And there's also programs and services, postal service, weather service, aviation administration, and so on, which is being paid by the US. So probably the contribution from the US is bigger than these 800 million over 20 years. Yeah, and the US donor money makes approximately 70% of the country's total GDP. In Greenland, we're having a GDP of around 20 billion Danish kroner, and around 4 billion is the block grant from Denmark, from the Danish government, which is, then we will end up with 20% of our GDP being the grant. So the grant that the Marshall Islands are receiving from the US is more important than the grant that we are actually receiving from Denmark. The US has got the full responsibility for hard security in the islands. And of course, hard security is always an important part of foreign policy, but it could be interesting to hear whether the Marshall Islands has got any influence on the hard security. What can they oppose US initiatives, for instance, within hard security? Is there any body regulate the hard security issues between, I mean, a body between the US and the Marshall Islands? That would be interesting to hear. But it's a very asymmetric relationship, and the economy of the islands are extremely depending on the strategic interest of the US. But that's the reason why they're getting the funds. And I'm just, it could be interesting to hear about whether there are some initiatives for loosening this dependency, economic development, growth, and so on. Other ways of supporting themselves. But the islands would probably still need future support from the US, because they also still have to mitigate the effects of the US military activities on the islands. But I guess the US interest wouldn't diminish in the future. Yeah, and again, we see a lot of similarities between us and the islands, but also many differences. We probably have a better opportunity to develop a self-sustaining economy, but our government needs more revenue to finance a welfare economy in our vast and Arctic country. It's going to be a big task for us. But free association is clearly a possibility for a future independent Greenland. But it will also be a political status that comes with both benefits, more freedom and sovereignty, as well as drawbacks, less social security from the Danish state. In terms of citizenship, there are rather big differences between Greenland and the Marshall Islands. We have one interesting factor, and that's the Nordic cooperation. Greenlanders will continue being Nordic citizens, and which will secure rights in another way than what the Marshall Islanders has in relation to the US. Greenlanders being Nordic citizens would still, through being Nordic citizens, Greenlanders would still be able to live, work, and have social rights in Denmark and other Nordic countries. So, and this is probably one of the reasons why the Nordic cooperation could be in the future more relevant for Greenland to participate in. The Cook Islands, I think it's so interesting, this change that has happened in the relationship in terms of citizenship. That you've had generations of politicians telling that it was impossible to gain independence and still keeping the citizenship or having the dual citizenship, and now it's changing the attitude. That's extremely interesting, but it's all politics, because in politics are not it's not physics. It's not chemistry. It's all about feelings, and it's all about what pays for. I mean, it's a negotiation, and I'm sure for New Zealand, it seems like a good idea to have this dual citizenship as a way to keep the Cook Islands. I might be wrong, but it could be a strategy, a way to keep the Cook Islanders close to New Zealand. I remember very well, as a young man, I was working in New Zealand on farms, and I remember these shearing teams, big with Cook Islanders, big guys who were shearing the sheep. So, and still, New Zealand is an important destination for Cook Islanders for work, and probably it will be so in the future as well. So there is a New Zealand that probably needs the Cook Islands, as it makes New Zealand a little bit bigger, emotionally or physically, and the Cook Islanders needs New Zealand as a destination for work and then get income for the country. So it's going to be interesting to observe this, whether they're going to declare nationhood and how should I put it, to become members of the UN. That's probably the way to say it. So yeah, that's what I just wrote down, and I've been told that I don't have any more. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Usually the free association agreements spell out the time for which the agreement should be available. And pay attention to the word free in association. It's free to enter, free to exit, and it is not necessarily a final step in a process unless and until the parties so agree. But for free association, I believe, to be attractive to the Greenlanders, it has to bring something to the table that they do not have today. And looking at the models we have for free association elsewhere, I believe the gains that the Greenlanders could look forward to, if any, in terms of free association would be, number one, sovereignty and statehood and continuation of that membership in international organizations like the UN, like the Arctic Council, and increased domestic powers in a number of areas. All of this, of course, to be agreed upon by the parties. But I believe sovereignty is the crucial element which Greenlanders would look forward to gaining through a free association agreement, be a stepping stone to full independence. Another aspect which could also be of interest, not least because I see Akaluk coming as a discussant later, that an sovereign Greenland with membership in international organizations would be able to step up on behalf of other Inuit and indigenous peoples elsewhere in forums like the UN General Assembly, Security Council, a number of international bodies where indigenous peoples do not have access today, but where Greenland as a sovereign state would have access and could speak up and seek to protect their interests and points of view. One more point about free association. It was mentioned by another speaker. The free association agreement does not have to be done with a colonial power. can be done with any other state, like the United States, like Canada. The Greenlanders would have a choice in that respect. But now that I have listed some of the positive aspects that could come with free association, like sovereignty, like statehood, like membership in intergovernmental organizations, access to the Olympics, ability to stand up for causes of interest to them, there may also be some negative aspects to the possible introduction of free association. It could be seen and used by a colonial power for purposes of delaying tactics, of diverting the attention and the debate away from independence. It could also lead to increased independency on financial contributions. And it could very well also bring about pressure from the colonial power for a long-term agreement on free association, whereas that is not necessary per definition of the term. So these are some of the issues that I think are relevant to our free association discussion. It has positive aspects. It has some possible dangers. Parties need to be aware of these. I think it's very important from the Greenlandic side, the Greenlandic politicians and the Greenlandic public, before any discussion were to take place about free association, that the politicians and the public come together and formulate joint opinion, joint approach to what it is they would want and expect from free association, so that Greenland would enter into negotiations with Denmark, if indeed that will ever take place in this context, with a clear idea of what they want to obtain. And finally, one can wonder if this meeting, I thank you, Ulrich, for the invitation. I think it's an interesting topic. But one has to wonder if this is just more academic wanderings in the wilderness. What will be the Greenlandic reactions, if any, to this introduction of the renewed introduction of the free association idea? And number two, what will be the reaction of the Danish authorities? Will Denmark come forward with ideas or proposals concerning free association? I think these questions, of course, are very basic for our discussion. And if I am not mistaken, indeed, if these negotiations or discussions take place, the big issues will be sovereignty and statehood, membership in international organizations, and then the question of what powers or functions that sovereign state of Greenland would possibly want to delegate to Denmark in terms of, for example, defense or some financial outlays. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Wandering in the wilderness is, in my experience, also always a risk in academia, but I'm sorry to say also in politics. Next presenter was very close to be in the room, but then she was called back to Akureyri. Rachel Johnstone will talk about free association in the United Nations. Like Gudmundur, she's a lawyer specialized in international law, particularly human rights and indigenous people's rights. She managed to have two jobs as a professor, both in Akureyri and Ilisimatusarfik. That alone impresses me very much, that you can be two places at the same time. Rachel, please.
Thank you very much. I'd just also like to thank today's speakers for some really illuminating remarks that have prepared the way for my presentation. I grew up in Scotland in the United Kingdom. I've been in Iceland for 20 years and I'm now an Icelandic citizen. I first came to Greenland in 2011 and I've been teaching on and off at Ilisimatusarfik since then. So I have learned a huge amount from senior Greenlandic scholars and politicians and others, as well as the students that I've come across over the years. And then, of course, there's my mentor, who's just presented, Guðmundur Alfredsson, who laid a lot of the groundwork, along with Meningwat Kleist, from the Greenland perspective on the history behind the Greenland integration. I mean, we've already heard a lot today about free association being a very wide brush. It's anything between integration and being a colony on the one side and full independence on another. And we have these 5 countries or 5 states with formal status, but many more examples of similar relationships. And Guðmundur in his paper mentioned the Iceland-Denmark relation between 1918 and 44, and we've heard about the British dominions as well. Now, of course, the emphasis is on free. It's a very loose arrangement that you can determine almost always by treaty, the Cook Islands being an exception, between 2 sovereign entities. But the free association status, as we've heard, is not necessarily permanent, and certainly in the UN's early work was not perceived as being a permanent state. So when we read the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly that endorsed the Cook Islands free association arrangement with New Zealand, it also considers that to be a step on the path. So it reaffirms the responsibility of the UN to assist the people of the Cook Islands in the eventual achievement of full independence if they so wish. So this is just to take under what Guðmundur and others have said, that free association is not a final agreement. The whole point is that you're engaging with sovereignty, and sovereignty is the right to change your mind, to do something different in future, to make new agreements with the former colonial power, with another power. We've examples also of independence not being necessarily permanent. States abolished themselves. Going back to my own country, Scotland and England both abolished themselves in 1706 to perform to create a new union of the United Kingdom. But in the 20th century, we have the creation of Tanzania that was formed from 2 newly independent states that had both recently decolonized from UK, Tanganyika and Zanzibar. Ultimately, what I want to talk about today is the relationship of free association and the United Nations, and what would be the steps that would need to be ensured in order for that to go ahead. I published a briefing note that has been translated into Danish and Greenlandic with DIIS, so you can read more of the details about. I outlined some of the benefits and some of the costs about joining United Nations. I don't want to repeat all that here, but perhaps to think about more of the practical steps that need to be overcome, some of the questions that have been raised. It is, of course, theoretically possible that in the agreement on free association, or in an agreement with free association, be that with Denmark or some other state, it could be written into the treaty that they may not join international organizations without the consent of the other party. But ultimately, why would they? We need to think also politically, why would Denmark object to Greenland becoming a member of the United Nations? Yes, it's another post-colonial vote in the UN, but it's also another Nordic vote. It's another Nordic bloc, another European vote that can also shore up that influence. Ultimately, membership of United Nations pivots on it being a state. And there seems to be some misunderstandings about the relationship between citizenship and statehood. Miriam talked a little bit about that earlier in the context of the Cook Islands, but I want to explore that a little bit more today, because I think that we need to separate those 2 concepts. Now, in practice, it just so happens that the 3 states in free association that are UN members have distinct citizenship regimes. And the 2 that are not UN members do not have distinct citizenship regimes, but share citizenship with New Zealand. However, that's a coincidence. It's not, it doesn't have any kind of legal implication. So if we think about the way the UN has expanded from 45 to the present day, we've gone from 51 states to 193. We had 40 new states between 1955 and 1960, almost all decolonizing states. Another bulk admission in the early 90s with the demise of the Soviet Union. So most states, when they become independent, do seek admission to United Nations. We can see that also in non-colonial contexts, like the Balkan states, collapse of Yugoslavia, South Sudan as well. So most of them do seek to join the United Nations. It's a shortcut to recognition. It's a way to gain influence. It might have expenses in hosting a delegation in New York or Geneva and Vienna, but ultimately it's a lot cheaper than holding separate embassies in various different countries. It allows influence on the General Assembly. It allows influence, as Gudmundur said, and referring also to Akluk's work, that not only with regard to Greenland's own interests, but Greenland can also stand up for Inuit in other parts of Inuit Nunat, as well as other indigenous peoples beyond our borders. And of course, being in the United Nations creates a kind of stability. The state is now recognised, even if there's an extremely unlikely in Greenland's context, but when we've seen states that are so-called failed states like Afghanistan or historically Somalia, they don't cease being states. Once they're in the United Nations, their status is guaranteed. The costs of joining are very low in terms of direct costs. So the annual duties are very low, just a few tens of thousands of dollars. But there are some administrative burdens, especially to do with the UN Human Rights Treaty system. There's a lot of reporting obligations that would have to be conducted. But it's not for me to say whether a Greenland in free association or as an independent state should or should not join the United Nations. That's something only Greenlanders can decide. But in terms of joining, there is really only one provision in the UN Charter that governs that. And that's Article 4, which I cite in the DIIS briefing. It says that membership in the United Nations is open to all other peace-loving states which accept the obligations contained in the present charter and in the judgment of the organisation are able and willing to carry out these obligations. And as the International Court of Justice explained in its advisory opinion in 48, those conditions are exhaustive. There are only 5 conditions. It must be a state, it must be peace-loving, it must accept the obligations of the Charter, and be able and willing to carry them out. The process goes through United Nations General Assembly and Security Council. There is a possibility that the UN Security Council becomes dysfunctional, given the current situation with Ukraine. I don't think that's very likely for lots of reasons, but even if it were dysfunctional, it's not dysfunctional forever. The war in Ukraine is not forever. The United Nations Security Council will sooner or later have to operate effectively again. In terms of the General Assembly, there is no doubt that the majority of states in General Assembly would welcome an independent state with open arms. So ultimately, it's Greenland's decision whether or not to join the UN. Now, going back to those 5 criteria, which are in Article 4 of the Charter and in the International Court of Justice opinion, they are that Greenland be peace-loving, I think that's not in question, accept the obligations and is willing to carry them out. Again, the fact that they've applied for membership shows that acceptance and that willingness, that they're able to carry out the obligations, which I'll return to, and that Greenland is a state. Now, clearly Greenland today is not a state and cannot therefore join. In terms of being able to carry out the obligations of UN membership, there was some discussion in the 1960s, especially led from the United States, about these so-called microstates, these very small population states, concerned that the United Nations General Assembly would become more multipolar, with a kind of implication that this was a bad thing. This was undesirable to have all these new voices at the UN. We've certainly overcome that, not only in terms of state size, but also accepting that we do have a multipolar world and that it is in the benefit of peace and security all over the world that we have more voices heard in the UN. But we have 5 post-colonial states with populations smaller than Greenland that are full members of UN, and 3 European so-called microstates, Liechtenstein, San Marino and Monaco, which also have populations smaller than Greenland. So the real question comes to, is Greenland a state or not? Today it's not a state because ultimately it's under the Constitution and the Supreme Court of the Kingdom of Denmark. Now, Greenland has drafted a new constitution. That is, of course, just the first step. There needs to be a lot of discussions about whether and how that constitution may or may not be adopted. But ultimately, it's clear today that Constitution of the Kingdom of Denmark is the last word in Greenland, and therefore Greenland does not have ultimate sovereignty. Now, having said that, sovereignty is a tricky beast. Denmark does not have ultimate sovereignty either. Denmark is not sovereign in lots of affairs, including trade and fisheries, because it's a member of the European Union. So sovereignty is not always black and white. But in the context of being a state for the purposes of the UN, you need to have a constitution that no one else can overrule. That may happen in a free association agreement. So the question really is, would Greenland in free association be a state? There are 5 tests of being a state. Do you have a territory? Yes, it's enormous. Do you have a people, a permanent population? Yes, Greenland has a permanent population, but I'll come back to that and how it links to citizenship. Greenland has a government. It's not today the last point of authority because it's under the Kingdom of Denmark constitution, but that can be changed. Ultimately, in free association, Greenland can be in charge of its own constitution, and Greenland already has a capacity for international relations. But this test of having a permanent population is not the same as citizenship. So we have examples, and some were mentioned earlier, the British Dominions, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa at this time being an apartheid state, all joined the League of Nations and the United Nations before they were completely independent of the UK, when they were still British subjects. Now, the British Constitution talks about being subjects rather than citizens. It's more of a kind of feudal hierarchical model than a sort of French egalitarian model. But ultimately, in international law, it has the same effect. But we have these 4 states that join the League of Nations or UN when they don't have distinct citizenship regime. We also have India as a founding member of UN when it was still a British colony. But that's not as interesting as Pakistan, because on partition, Pakistan joined the United Nations when its residents, its members, the Pakistanis, were in fact still British citizens. And then we can look at Ireland in 1922, when the Irish Free State was created. Residents of Northern Ireland automatically had dual citizenship, both British and Irish. And under the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which is an international treaty between Ireland and the United Kingdom, there is also a right of citizens in Northern Ireland to hold dual citizenship of both Ireland and United Kingdoms. And I think these examples show that citizenship and being a statehood are quite distinct things. So whether or not Greenland decides, or Greenland and Denmark together decide to have a shared citizenship regime or a separate citizenship regime, albeit with certain rights for the peoples in each side to work and study in each other's countries, that is not the test for becoming a UN member. So the citizenship question is not fundamental to UN membership. We can also see an example in Cook Islands again, where we have a recognition that the Cook Islands are a state, even though they don't have a distinct citizenship regime. That's recognised by the Supreme Court of New Zealand and the British Privy Council. Cook Islands has been admitted to other international organisations that are only open to state members, including the World Health Organization, the International Criminal Court, and UNESCO. So ultimately, the question of citizenship is not pivotal to UN membership, although it's certainly something that will have to be carefully negotiated. And it's really interesting to see that for decades, Greenlandic leaders have been thinking about what they want in terms of their relationship with Denmark. It seems to me, and this is my personal opinion and not that of a legal scholar, that Denmark also needs to take a good hard look about what it wants with its relationship with Denmark. This has to be a mutually negotiated settlement, and it should be a mutual and equal negotiation. So Denmark can't just sit back and wait for Greenland to say this is what we want. We can't just have a kind of, in 1953, we complained that Greenland was told you have a take it or leave it, this or nothing, with very little information. These negotiations, and this goes back to the question of the last speaker, this negotiation needs to also have the Denmark government step up and say what is it that they're looking for in their relationship with Greenland, and how can this be a mutually beneficial relationship. So I'll leave it there and just thank all the speakers for the presentations today and all the briefing notes that have come in, as well as the decades and decades of excellent work that's been done in Greenland in addressing the very complex and dynamic situation. Thank you. Ko Jana.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I was just about to find out how to stop you, but then you stopped. So that was perfect timing. So I'd like to invite Tudor Skåle to put on this camera and.
Do we have time for questions?
No, because Rachel used 15 minutes sharp. So
we'll take that in here.
Yeah, Tudor Skåle
Yes.
is now a member of the Danish Parliament for Jafnaðarflokkurin, Social Democrats, I call them. But in an earlier incarnation, he was deeply involved in the negotiation of those 2000 negotiations of the Faroese government at that time about a looser relationship to Denmark. He was an aide to Høgni Hoydal, who's now again the foreign minister for Tjorveldet in Tórshavn. But more interestingly, he published a book in Faroese and a lot of years later in Danish about these experiences with these negotiations. I read it as kind of a tragic political thriller, but it's very readable. But I hope, sure, that you will share some of your experiences here with us. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent.
Perfect.
First of all, I will say congratulations with the new draft constitution. It is a necessary thing to do. It's a necessary work to do because it's obvious for everyone that Denmark is not the state that the Danish constitution describes. In the Faroe Islands, not a single person sees the Parliament of Denmark as their parliament. Nobody sees it that way. But the constitution says that the Parliament of Denmark is the Danish parliament. It is very far from the reality. In my view, Denmark is not a unitary state in reality. It's some kind of federation. And to formalize that is, I think, a necessary work to be done, and it's a good thing if it comes from the Faroes or from Greenland. As was said, I'll tell you a story from the Faroe Islands that might be relevant to the Greenlandic process, and I hope you can learn something from that, because as it was said, in the year 2000 we did negotiate about Faroese independence with the aim of establishing a new constitutional framework. We also called it free association. I guess I'm here because I did participate as a civil servant, and later I wrote this tell-all book about what happened during these negotiations. It's just been sold for dramatization, for a series for maybe Netflix, so it's quite exciting. It was quite dramatic back then, really. The momentum came from a very deep economical crisis in the Faroes in the 90s, where Denmark first stepped in and rescued our economy, but then through a series of deals that were where we borrowed huge amounts of money from Denmark set aside the Faroese authorities and basically took over the country. In doing so, it became clear that they helped a Danish bank, Danske Bank, to escape its losses in the Faroes. Losses that were hanged around the neck of the Faroese people. There was a total loss of trust between the parties, and in 1998 a Faroese government was elected that wanted to establish a sovereign Faroese state in close cooperation with Denmark, and also share the head of state with Denmark in this free association arrangement. The clear model was all the way through the arrangement that was between Denmark and Iceland from 1844, that has been mentioned sometimes now, a couple of times. And what can Greenland learn from that? Well, it can learn that the legal arrangements are one thing, academical discussions are one thing, but when they meet political realities, nobody knows what will happen. And those realities were back then that Denmark was against the wishes of the Faroese government, and another very important reality was that the Faroese majority behind the project was very slim. So the Faroese government knew that any cost of independence would lead to a loss of this crucial support. So in the draft contract, the long and detailed free association contract between Denmark and the Faroe Islands, there were three things that everybody knew were absolutely crucial. The Danish government knew it as well. Number one, citizens of the Faroe state should keep their full rights that they enjoyed as citizens of the Danish state. This indeed was the case for Icelanders from 18 to 44. Because if a person wanted independence for the country, he would probably hesitate. Many of them would hesitate voting for secession if it on a personal level would cost him the rights that he and his children enjoyed or could enjoy in Denmark. It was too high a price for many people. Number two, the Danish state should, for the right cost, assist the new Faroe state for some years in areas that until then had been under Danish control, like judiciary system, police, and so on. Again, people in these areas, they wanted to safeguard their job and their safety and on a personal level, in order to be willing to vote for what they might think was right for the country on a collective country level. Number three, the Danish financial support for the Faroes, the so-called block grant, should not appear from one day to the other. That should be gradually phased out, gradually reduced over a period of 15 years. Again, many people hold idealistical views and dream about the Faroe state, but a lot of them would not vote according to those views if they were afraid it would cost them economically on a personal level. As I said, everybody knew this, including the Danish government. So the negotiations started. The Faroese government had a goal. The goal could only be achieved without the political, administrative, and economical help from the Danish government. But the Danish government had a different goal. They did not want to lose sovereignty over the Faroes. The goal of Denmark was preserving the union as it was. So the Faroese government was dependent on getting something from the Danish government in order to achieve a goal that the Danish government was against. It was a very complicated situation because the goal of Denmark was another. And Denmark knew that it would be very easy to achieve their goal. They didn't even have to say a clear no to all the Faroese wishes. A small yes would suffice, would be enough. So the Danish Prime Minister said no to double citizenship, but said that Denmark would help the Faroes become part of Nordic treaties that would grant Faroese citizens almost the same rights in Denmark as Danes. He said that Danish civil servants would indeed be allowed to assist the new state, the new Faroe state, but the Danish government wanted to know beforehand the exact timetable, the exact amount of work that Danish civil servants would have to do, and the exact price that the Faroese government was willing to pay for this. The Faroese government back then was not in a position where they were able to provide these numbers. So it was a no disguised as a yes. The so-called block grant would indeed be reduced gradually, but not over 15 years, but 4 years. 4 years. So Denmark said yes. The Faroe Islands could indeed get their independence peacefully through a deal with Denmark. No oppression, no denial of any rights. But the Faroese people were split. If Denmark had fulfilled all the wishes of the Faroese government fully and completely, there would probably be a small majority in favor of secession. But if just a few people were reluctant to pay a personal price, the majority was gone. I know that this thing about the personal price might sound a bit spoiled or something. Other people kill and die for independence. But when half the people are ideologically against secession and half are in favor, then such small practicalities are important. There were not 51% of, you can say, hardliners. There were maybe 30, 40% of hardliners willing to pay a personal price. So the finding thing is that the Faroese people did not did not feel oppressed within the Danish state. Some were in favor of staying there, and some were not willing to pay a big price for leaving. So after 4 very dramatic meetings, it all ended in nothing. And then another, and in my opinion, far more fruitful process started, namely building the house from the ground. The block grant was reduced by a third by Faroese initiative in 2001 and has since been frozen nominally and is now being reduced again even more. When this election period is over, it will be around 550 million Danish kroner, which is far less than $100 million, a very small amount. Areas have been taken over gradually all the time, so that we are now in a position where just a very few common areas are left that are ruled by Denmark. Of course, judiciary system and police are formally Danish, but almost completely run by Faroese people. And then there is security, where we gradually are taking responsibility, and of course, defense. Defense is purely Danish. Monetary system and banks are formally Danish, but in reality, of course, more European, and the banks are Faroese. So I think we have achieved far more through this gradual evolutionary process over the last 20 years than we did achieve through the more revolutionary approach of 2020. And it's been done without any internal polarization in the Faroes. People have been aboard, people have been supporting, and this is, of course, the most crucial thing of all. If we now came to a position, if there now was a momentum for secession, the chances are that it would lead to something are far greater now than they were in 2000, because the ground is much stronger. Our economy is stronger. We have taken over far more areas. We are in a much stronger position. Then Denmark has a far weaker hand in the negotiations today than they had in the year 2000. In fact, we have also a draft constitution for the Faroes, and I think, as I said, once the momentum is there, it will be possible to get it implemented, because we are in a strong position now. As I said in the beginning, I think what the work you have done is really good and very important. But the political angle is that you must never forget that common people are not that interested in legal discussions and whatever you call an arrangement, free association or federation or whatever. People focus on their personal day-to-day lives, and you can't blame them for that. And if it is the economical and social and political and cultural reality that matters to the electorate, and if these things, if the economical and social reality can be bettered by a new legal arrangement, then people get aboard and supportive. If they don't see that, why should they be supportive? And this is where I see the very weak point in Greenlandic negotiation position. It is that the economy is not very strong. So if Denmark wants to stop it from happening, they say, well, the economy is here. We can stop the money flowing from Denmark to Greenland, and then this will be the consequence, and then we have to stop anyway. So I think it's a good idea to start to build the house from the ground. And even if this is a very important work, there is a chance that it will meet the political reality and not being it will cause problems. This is where my initial remarks. I'm be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. As a discussion for this session, we are very happy that Dr. Blume is here. Very vocal voice for what I was told by earlier, that I was not to say the youth rebellion of the 70s, former leader of Ilisimatusarfik, former president of the ICC. Please.
Thank you for the invitation. I understand that I have 10 minutes, and thank you to.
We would have 15, but I will warn you in 10.
Okay, and thank you to Sugar Skåle and Arcade for your presentations. It was interesting. I was supposing that we had a kind of the articles. So. In my work with international issues and Greenlandic national interest all over the world, I have always tried to tell people that how many we are, that we are only 55,000 people, and we have the largest country, the largest island in the world. But whenever we mention independence and other questions, it would be a discussion about where we stand in the world. If you look at the Arctic right now and the cooperation that have taken hold since '96, almost everything that we have established in 1996 through Arctic Council are on its way down. And since the invasion of Ukraine, the Arctic Council and the Arctic Indigenous Peoples Cooperation has been squandered. We don't know what to do in the near future. You see the words of the cannons and the war in Ukraine are talking much higher than our own small whispers here in the Arctic, because that war is going to continue in the Arctic. I say that because we should be very careful in discussing these issues. And for the sake of the Greenland population, for the sake of our nation, we should be very careful and not telling people that we take this and this name. The word "Namitasomna" in Greenland is can be translated into independence. It can be translated to everything almost, but not about a state. Creating a state is something else. And we have been discussing these issues for so long that I think that we now can understand what the others are talking about and what others are, the nationalists and the separatists, whatever we call them, what their position is. But for all of us, the lessons from the Cold War, and especially from the last World War, the lessons were that the United States wanted to buy us or take us. And the last word we had was in 2019. But even in 1947, there was a plan which the Greenland Land Council also were probably informed about and probably also had in mind when they, in 1948, decided to say yes to Hans Ritter, the Prime Minister of Denmark, that asked the question, where do we want to belong in the future? And the Greenlanders, although colonized, they can think. They also had the ideas of the future, and our ancestors were able to form the society that we have today. That society that are built on tolerance, a society that understands that we have several indigenous groups here, and the society that also understands its own nationhood. Our nation is born through the Inuit ancestors that came here 1,200 years ago through Tule. On the other hand, since 1800s, we have been mixed with the Danish bloc as well. And if we look at the situation right now and compare to the Canadian situation, where you have so many other indigenous groups around them. They also have someone called Métis, which is half Indian, half white. So if we were in Canada, Canada, I think, would be maybe mentioned as Métis, because we are mixed race. That's not very interesting when we are talking about the issues right now. Of course, we haven't seen a non-white state being formed any other place in the world the last 20 years. We haven't seen any development, even though the Faroese can be called the white people, along with the Scandinavian people there. They are not even allowed to form their country themselves. So when we come to the question about Greenland and its possession, we should remember that the strategic situation is the one that dictates everything. We can have a feeling of, yes, we want to do this and that, but how about the situation between us? Do we have a friendly nations around here? Well, in fact, the US have its air base up there. It's called Space Base Thule now. And in the rest of Greenland, we are not even near to fight for ourselves if someone should take our land. We have nothing. It's only the ice that up till now have been the one that secured our security. It's it's very funny, but it's the ice. So if the climate change continues the way it does, that would change the whole situation. That would change the whole strategic situation. And we have China, of course, and their interests, and then we have the Soviet Union that is called Russia now, but we have had relations with them because Inuit also live up there. Where is it? So Inuit also live up there with Sareda. I've been visiting most of it and also know the Russian indigenous people as well. And with the war in Ukraine, the things our relations have changed so profoundly that we have to start from the beginning. And then there comes the the Alaskan and Canadian situation. On the strategic issue, the United States is probably a friend. They have their space base up there, but their political interests have not changed. And only in 2019, there was a politician that wanted to buy Greenland, and it is consistent with what the policies and the US politicians have talked about Greenland, the way they have done about it. They can understand and they know that Iceland is independent, but they also white. We are not. That's the basic issue here. So in the end, I think it's very important that the Greenlanders themselves understand and discuss further what Naminasona means for them. Do they mean independence? Do they mean another kind of association? Or do they mean that we can solve this problem we can look at this situation together with the Danes, like we have done for so many years. And maybe that's the one solution that we need. I think the situation is right now, if it continues, it will be very difficult for us politically to achieve what we want if we don't understand what's going on around us and what kind of strong issues you can have there. I thought that when I went to New Zealand that I would see in New Zealand there's 500,000 of them, but I saw also mostly white people, and they have they were the ones that are the heads of that country. Even though you are millions, I know I have a friend in India, and I asked him, you are from an indigenous group in India, so how many are you? Oh, we are 4 million. So you see, the differences between those situations are very intriguing. And but our first job, in my opinion, in the future, is the starting and understand what Greenlanders, the public, actually wants. I am not sure if we said tomorrow that we will have a vote on independence, that it would fail drastically, and that would destroy our further discussions. So we should be very, very careful. And the draft constitution, they couldn't even, the commission couldn't even agree on which way to go. And this is a real problem, a real political problem. There's no, as you have mentioned, and your Puerto Rican situation is very interesting. It's very funny that when we are in the United Nations and we are talking and making big speeches and the like, and afterwards we can go to the Danish mission and talk to them. So what do you think you like my talk? And we can laugh to each other, but many other indigenous peoples, when they have spoken on the lecture of the United Nations, they might be subject to something else when they return home. Yes, maybe that's what I want to say. We have to look at what peaceful mission it could be if Greenlanders themselves try to talk to each other and understand. First, from there, we can take the next step.
We're not.
All right. Welcome back. Now for our final session, and hopefully we will have a bit more time also to Q&A, what we call town hall. A month ago, Greenland came out with a draft constitution, and many of us has hope, and some have complained, and some are still hoping that there will be a political debate about this draft constitution, also about the association. So we have invited some of our politicians. Ulrik and I did a big mistake back at Christmas time when we found this date. We should have thought about being in the part of Institute Assembly, and actually on a day that is quite important in Parliament. So that's our mistake. That's another mistake. Yeah. We have two politicians from the Institute of Greenland Parliament, Bruno Felker from Nuuk and Peter Broberg from Nuuk. I'm very happy to see both of you. One version could be that we have the government party and the opposition party, and they even switched places a year ago, or a bit more than that. The other version, and now I'm paraphrasing you during lunch, that it's an echo chamber. Maybe you are not the politicians that are the furthest apart on some of these questions. But it is, we should really stress that we have been in contact. We really wanted to have someone from Atassut come in. We had an agreement with Demokratiet, the Liberal Party, but they couldn't make it. They said Saturday evening. IA was invited, but because of the assembly, that didn't happen. So I'm very, very happy that we are able to have two presentations. And I don't know if we should let the opposition start. And as I mentioned in my panel, in my discussion earlier on, Siumut and Nalarak are maybe the two most vocal parties in terms of advocacy on free association. Over time, it has changed. Maybe now, Peter Broberg more than anybody in politics is the one expressing this. But we also hope that it's not something that just come up during the election campaign, that we can also have the slower discussion and maybe have some of the comparative insight to get to another level of debating what free associations are. But I've given you somewhat on the last week where you can be very political and see, well, I want this, I want this, or you can do some reflection on what we have discussed today. But I will give the floor to your opinion.
Really cool versus been
Sure.
Do I need the mic? Well, okay. I'm Kuno Fenker. I'm a member of the parliament for the party Siumut. I'm also a former student from this university. I'm actually also studying in South Danish University for Master of Law. I only need my final thesis, so I'm here. I'm here just a little bit stressed. I'm not gonna review all the things that people said, but I would say that I'm more informed than I have ever been in regards to the concept of the free association, and also in regards to what kind of challenges and positive things different islands and free association countries are experiencing. And actually, I hear quite a lot of positive and open-minded thinking from many of you guys, except for two elderly Greenlandic people. Maybe Danish, that's just kidding. You know, our nationality in Greenland is Danish. And
You can't take away our nationality. That's also why we want to become our own citizens. That's why we want a pragmatic solution in regards to how we take the different steps to Greenland's statehooship. We started in 1700s, and we had what the Danish called an instruks, and sort of a law of how Danish people should treat the Greenlanders as or Inuit for trading. And then we had some what you call forstandderskaber. I don't know exactly what you will call them in English, but they were sort of like a little democratic way of having Inuit people a little bit of say in a way. And then we had the county members that were in a way cheated for becoming into the Danish constitution in 1953. We already heard about that, so I'm not going to elaborate too much on that, but that was totally against the UN resolution of 637, I think, which required explicit democratic ways informing all the Inuit people and having a referendum and so forth. So we didn't get that in Greenland. But then we got the self-rule government in 79, which was sort of more informed and but still maybe in the youth stages of Inuit people's knowledge of what their total rights were in regards to statehoodship, full sovereignty, free association, integration, and the fourth possibility that came a little bit later in the UN was a sort of a organization which we have here in Greenland and Denmark today, which nobody in the world can figure out how sort of should work directly. And we don't even know here in Greenland how and Denmark how we should work with each other, because it always depends on what kind of a government we have in Denmark. Depending on what kind of government we have in Denmark, we can probably have a say in the Arctic Council. We can probably have a little bit more say in regards to not international organizations, but organizations that are very vital for our economy in regards to fisheries. And that's not feasible anymore. It's not doable. We have to, that's why we have to change the system. But we have to change it in a pragmatic way, which informs people what is it that they are going to vote about. What kind of a referendum are we going to have? Is it a diamond? Is it an apple or is it an egg? We don't know. That's why the self-rule government paragraph 21, which is the startup for the negotiations with Denmark, or just maybe they are starting up with a referendum for Greenlanders. Do you want secession or not? That's not feasible in our eyes. We need to have a negotiation first and know exactly what is it that we are voting for. What kind of a referendum should we have? What kind of rights should we give out to another state, for example? Or which parts should we cooperate on and which parts should we take ourselves? And I'm not going to open up in regards to exactly how we want it in Siumut, because that would be bad for our negotiation stand right now. I'm just going to say we have to start this negotiation. Actually, Siumut tried to start the negotiation a few weeks ago, but it was downed by the Democrats, EA, and Adesud, of course. The only party that said, okay, we want to start this process of negotiation was Netherlands. So That's how the political stand is right now, in my view. If you say no to a startup of the paragraph 21, you don't want free association, you don't want independence or statehooship right now. I don't know what kind of ideas they have for the future, but this system we have right now with the organization with Denmark is not organized. We have to start to organize it. And that's why we need, with all the discussions that we had here today, to initiate the startup of the paragraph 21 of the self-rule government. Thank you.
From the political party that don't want independence. I've asked him to go into our website and log in again. And we have it in Danish as well, and just so that. Just keep it there. First, I'll tell you why we'll never get free association. Then I'll say why we might do it. Welcome to my introduction to what we've been talking about today. First of all, set up as one of the assumption that people and the political parties in Greenland actually wanted independence. When I first joined politics in 2018, I asked the then chairman of our political party, Hans Enoksen, how do you want to do this? And he said, doesn't matter, he just wanted it out from under the Kingdom of Denmark. And I said, well, we've got to have sort of a plan. And he said, well, the means to an end, doesn't matter. All right. And I said, do you mind if I look at what the international rules and regulations in connection with decolonization is? And I was given the go ahead. So in 2018, when we ran for parliament, my wife and I, we actually presented how we wanted to do a free association process with Denmark. Now, the first thing that happened when we presented that, back then he wasn't in Siumut, he was not in that political system. Siumut, Inuit Democrats, well, basically every other political party attacked us. And one of the things they attacked us was, you cannot guarantee the outcome of it. I was like, no, nobody can. That's not how the system works. But what we found out back then was that none of the other political parties had any intentions of working for independence because none of them had a plan. If you don't have a plan, you have a wish. And wishes don't come true unless you work for them. So when we talked about the free association, we found out another thing as well. Siumut, Inuit did not want free association. Some of them talked about complete separation from Denmark, and some of them talked about political or economical independence only. But none of them wanted to say, yeah, we actually support that plan. None has to this date. That's why it's not a feasible arrangement, because when we look at the Danish government's side of this, they have tried to delay this as well, and they haven't officially said, yeah, we want to do that. On the other hand, they made sure to tell the rest of Greenland, no, we are not interested in any shape, way, or form supporting Greenland in the future if you want to become independent. So with those two things in mind, you can see why it won't ever happen. Why should it? Well, because in theory, what Greenlanders want when we talk about independence is determining their own future. In Danish, it's called Højesteret, which means the supreme law of the land should be with Greenlanders, not the Danish state. That's what most of them aspire to. Their own identity, their own nationality. But most have friends or families in Denmark, which also means that most of them want to keep a relationship with Denmark in some way, shape, or form. But the rhetoric is always from the Danish state or Danish members or assimilated Greenlanders that want to be in the Kingdom of Denmark. We want to punish you if you want to become independent. It's always punishment they're talking about. We'll cut off the blood brand. We will cut off your access to Denmark. A lot of things will happen if you want this. You have never heard a single Danish politician say, yep, let's do that. We'll figure out how to do it along the way. Not a single one. And as a famous Danish politician said, it is not my job to reduce the Kingdom of Denmark by 98%. That was his reasoning for putting Greenland under the Danish kingdom. And that makes sense. Of course it makes sense. But again, if you look at why we should do it, there are lots of reasons. But unfortunately, the real politics today dictates it will be a clean cut from Denmark in one way, shape, or form. Now, that won't happen. I know that for several reasons, not just because my mother is in Denmark. We can't foresee the future where we will actually cut off connections to Denmark. So how do we move forward? Is free association an option? Well, if cooler heads prevailed, it would be. But what are the other options? Well, one of them is we actually learn to save money for ourselves. Why do I say that? Because the main reason everybody keeps wanting to postpone independence is economy. And all the rationale you hear today has only to do with economy. So when you look at the economical standpoint, you can also see the fiscal year where we get the block grant from Denmark. That's what everybody talks about when you talk about independence, which means currently the price for independence for most people is 4 billion Danish kroner a year. In Denmark, we keep saying it has nothing to do with economics and everything to do with freedom. We are not isolationists. We are not nationalists, as some said earlier, or separatists. Decolonization cannot be labeled with that. The most appropriate, I think, would be freedom fighters, except we only fight with a microphone, not weapons. Everybody has access to weapons up here. So why is it that we haven't used them in this fight? Well, because everybody assumes the negotiating partner, which is Denmark, wants the best for us as well. Now, politics, you know how that goes. You don't have friends in politics, you have allies. Right now, many people talk about defense of Greenland. And it was said maybe we want to do a defense agreement with Denmark in a free association. My question would be then, why would we? The defense agreement that is valid today, which was signed when we were a colony, is with the United States. Why would we swap out the United States with Denmark? It just doesn't make sense. So when we talk about free association, there are a lot of factors that we could look at. But saving money is one of them, and say, basically, you have to be able to say, we want nothing from you. We just want our freedom. That's the only negotiation position you can have with a country like Denmark, with the history they have with Greenland and you. But we could get a lot more done if we didn't need to do that. We might still get a lot done if it comes to that. But those are my two main points that I want to share with you today. I know the law, I know the reasoning behind it, but as it was said by another person as well, politics is not just the legal framework, but that's what we operate on. I want to end with a quote to show you on our website. There's a reason why we actually put these information up in Greenlandic as well. Nobody has ever done public information with regards to ILO 169 and what the Danish state has claimed it wants to have as a responsibility. And they have never publicly debated Appendix 7, the definition of the Greenlandic people. They have never shown that other colonized people, countries that has become independent, how they determined the nationality. The nationality is actually the important one in this one, because who is allowed to vote for independence? Well, according to Chaplinsky, where he looked at all the identities, which means statehood, that people received when a former colony became independent in one way, shape, or form, is that the native population to that country got the new state's, what do you call it, citizenship, while the people that came as part of the colonization kept their metropole status. That's the overwhelming theme that they've looked upon. And I want to end with that note because in Greenland, if you want to vote for parliament or independence, there's only three major requirements. You have to be more than 18 years of age. You have to have lived here for more than 6 months and be a Danish citizen. There's no requirement of being Inuit or Greenlander. Thank you.
5 minutes away from the Nuuk goal, from the perspective of Ilisimatusarfik and Ilisimatusarfik, I really want to thank everybody who showed up, and especially all the panelists. This has been a very interesting debate, and the debate I hope continues, and probably also, as Gudmund said, this should also happen outside of academia and the Eiffel Tower. This is where we live, and this is where we are.
Eiffel Tower, that's in front.
That's a long way. Eiffel Tower. Double checking with also TikTok. I will just say thank you, and in fall, Ilisimatusarfik had a month ago we did a big conference on security policy in North American Arctic. Today on the association. In fall, we're going to change strategy a little bit. We will have like 2 hours debates, or if Vida is home from NATO or whatever, for 2 hours, so we don't have to spend that much time in getting all the bits and pieces together for a big conference, but also that we can cater more for a local audience. So now you know you'll be invited. Not every single week, but maybe once or twice a month to something interesting in relation to international relations. And then I will give, and then I'll just say thank you to, like it was his idea, he wrote me back in November. What do you think about this idea about having a conference about negotiation? And again, my whole argument is not just can we learn more about it, then I'm happy, basically. And then I will turn and thank you for the collaboration. I think we will do other stuff in the future. And when Ulrik is speaking, I will show you, I will do some like billeted on doing campaigning without really campaigning, showing the web page. And I can show you where you can find on Ilisimatusarfik homepage some of the working papers, where some of them are in Greenlandic as well. And hopefully we can continue to also have more text in Greenlandic on some of these topics.
So I really just you have to really do that fast because there are 2 minutes left, so I won't say much except that we will continue to do small things. So I'll add a couple of briefs out there that we did that's not related to free association, and that's I think is the format we're going to continue. As we're not going to make big seminars and conferences. We're going to concentrate on little stuff that is of interest to both people in Greenland and Denmark. Perhaps, I don't know. The only exception to that is this reconciliation, or maybe just examination of the colonial era procedure. I'm very excited to what will actually come out of that. I guess in a week or so there will be 2 weeks. There will be a meeting between Prime Minister of Greenland and Denmark, and they might say something about that. I have no idea how big it will be. Maybe it will be all hands on deck. So we might meet each other in that connection there. We'll be wiser. Thank you.